Opening. This is an audiobook recording of The Alpha's Son, Mpreg Possessive Romance. Part 1, written by J.K. Jones and narrated by Ian Dawn and Toss Michaels. This is an Alpha and Omega Mpreg werewolf shifter romance and contains mature themes intended for adult audiences. No part of this audiobook may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form without the prior written permission of the author. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Trigger warnings. This book includes mentions of fertility issues and eating disorders. Viewer discretion is advised. If you'd like to hear more audiobooks, please like and subscribe. Thank you for respecting the hard work of the author, and we hope you enjoy this story. Chapter 1. Ezra. I maneuvered through the crowd, carrying crates of liquor and stacking them neatly behind the bar. The patrons barely noticed me, their senses dulled by the intoxicating perfume of desperation and the swirling incense of tobacco. Smoke and mist hung thick in the air, blurring their faces as they swayed to the music. Bodies pressed together, moving as one, unable to tell where the rhythm of the drums ended and their heartbeat began. Like every night, I found myself captivated by the raw energy of this place, the pulse of life, chaos, and freedom that defined the nightlife here. I'd been living in this lovely corrupt city for months now, basking in the shadows of wicked men, the godless, and the heathens. It was perfect for someone like me, small and unassuming, an Omega who desperately didn't want to be seen, and yet somehow always was. I tightened the filthy once-white apron tighter around my waist and headed back out into the cool night air. I wished to melt into the shadows, become one with the earth. Had I been a vampire, that would have been easier. I would have dug a pit so deep and stayed there for millennia, never drifting out to see the new world, starving myself until the hunger became too ravenous and the skin clung to my bones. I sighed, tilting my head back and staring at the full moon up above. Dusk Song wasn't a place I would have chosen for myself, but being on the run, I didn't have many choices to begin with. Picking up another crate, I hauled it over my shoulder, opened the thick metal door, and headed back into the club. The Howling Den was a dump. Even through the vast strobing lights, I could see there was something not right with the wolves. Their skin was lit up, spider tendrils pulsing neon blue beneath their skin as they danced with their eyes rolled back into their heads, exposing their white sockets. They moved as if they had no limbs at all, oozing slinking things that jerked and popped their hips as if their strings were being pulled in every which way direction. I set the crate down, a familiar fear prickling down my spine as I watched them all. The strobe lights sync with the pounding bass, their flashes morphing into rolling waves of blue and green. The dance floor ripples like liquid glass, shimmering as though the sea itself had come alive beneath their feet. I swallowed hard and tore my gaze away, only to come face to face with Lake, the bartender, who nearly barreled into me. "Move it, runt!" he snapped, pushing past in his rush to serve the clamoring patrons. They crowded the bar, hands waving and money flashing, desperate as though trying to hail a taxi on a rainy night. It was pure chaos, the kind that sent a shiver down my spine, equal parts terrifying and utterly enthralling. "You there," Caleb uttered, glaring down at me. "Why aren't you buzzing the tables? Get to work." I jumped, scurrying off with a small bucket to clear off the tables. Caleb stood like a sentry, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his tattoos bulging on his arms. The Alpha had frightened me the moment I laid eyes on him. In this society, there are two main tiers of Alphas and Omegas, the higher-ranking ones, and the average Alphas and Betas. The lesser-ranked members can inflict pain through commands, a forbidden power, but the real hierarchy lies with those at the top, the elite, the ones who hold true power. And I happen to be one of them, sitting at the very top of that hierarchy where the ugliness of power is all too clear. A Primus Omega. The type of Omega that was afraid of its own shadow, ready to bend its neck at the nearest Primus Alpha. Both were extremely rare. It was so rare it was considered a myth in different parts of the world. I hated my designation, just like I hated all things regarding the Werewolf Society, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Caleb was massive. He towered over people like a great cypress tree, his gray eyes cut like a blade. Caleb was a Primus, and he was my boss. I maneuvered through the partygoers, ignoring his eyes on the back of my neck. Primus Alphas only wanted Primus Omegas. We were the few who could take his knot, which would cripple normal Omegas. But once again, he was my boss. He owned this establishment, and even though he was rude, he wouldn't risk his livelihood for anything. The wolves in the city were civilized. Had this been in my homelands? Well, that story would have been entirely different. Being a Primus Omega was worse than death. I had learned that the hard way. I grabbed some empty bottles and tossed them into my plastic bin. Someone bumped into me. I apologized, even though I knew it wasn't my fault, and they carried on. The music had hit its apex, with everyone moving as if they were possessed, their bodies bending and twisting with no regard for the rhythm. The sway of their torsos and the sharp, erratic flicks of their arms painted a picture of unsettling abandon, as though reality had slipped from their grasp. I saw a few in the back rooms, knocking back shimmering liquid in a vial. It looked like a swirl of sapphire, emerald, and violet. I noticed once the wolves drank from it, they became possessed. It unsettled me and threw my thoughts in disarray. I moved as quickly as I could, balancing the bin of discarded cups and glasses, but before I could get far, I barreled straight into someone. The bin jostled, sending cups crashing to the floor, where they rolled away, swallowed up by the crowd's stamping feet. Sorry. The words caught in my throat when I looked up. It was him. Panicking, I dropped the bin and bolted through the back doors, but before I could get too far, someone grabbed my arm with enough force to nearly dislocate it. A cry escaped me as the grip released, but he stayed too close, crowding me in. Stop! His voice boomed. My entire body turned to iron. I'm not going to hurt you. Let me go! I said frantically, my eyes darting around for anything I could use as a weapon. He sighed, smoothing a hand over his sweaty face. Why do you always have to make things difficult? You said you would leave me alone. You said after I couldn't speak anymore because he was advancing on me, towering over me. What do you want? Gideon Frost wasn't the type to play games, and yet I toyed with him. He tore out his badge, flashing the gold at me for a second before putting it back. Calm down. Nobody is going to hurt you. Gideon, I said. Release me. Gideon regarded me for a moment, then waved his hand and the command dissipated from my body. I staggered away from him, trying to catch my breath, my thoughts spinning as I tried to make sense of what he was doing there. Sorry, I wouldn't have used it if you weren't trying to run away. I laughed bitterly at that. I should be running away. I should be on the other side of the country by now. And do you think that would ever stop him? Gideon replied, his brown eyes softening. Sorry, we got off to the wrong start. I didn't mean... I shouldn't have startled you. Why don't we get some coffee? We can talk, okay? I released a harsh breath and shook my head. I'm working, I can't... The agency has quit on your behalf. Celine is packing your stuff in your apartment as we speak. Gideon said, his voice vacant. Come on, Ezra. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice. Sometimes I think you were put on this earth with the sole purpose of annoying me, I gritted out. Fine, let me change and get some clothes. He held up a duffel bag and shot me a wolfish grin. No need, I got you covered. 20 minutes, 2 detours, and a small headache. Later we were sitting across from each other in a small diner. Dusk Song was one of the largest cities in Thornhowl, and the area was bustling even though it was after 1 a.m. Gideon shifted in his chair, his navy blue uniform making him look every bit the Luminal Order informant that he was. With broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and kind mocha-brown eyes, the beta certainly looked unassuming most days, and it was why I trusted him in the first place when the Luminal Order first came to me. I stabbed the stir stick into my second cup of coffee, then cupped it between my hands, feeling the warmth bleed through. Gideon's mouth thinned, and he sighed. Why didn't you take the money they offered you? Money always comes with strings attached, and the last thing I needed was more strings. Are you here to arrest me? Gideon leaned in, his voice lowered to a whisper. Ezra, it's time. My whole body tensed, and for a moment I seriously considered jumping through the thick glass window just to escape him. The thought of clawing his face off, of shifting into my wolf form and tearing through the restaurant, crossed my mind. But even though Gideon was a beta, he was still bigger and stronger than me, and I was a Primus Omega, the smallest of them all. I don't understand what you mean. Gideon sighed. Ezra. No, I'm not going to arrest you. Maybe one of these days, but not today. Then what do you want? I demanded, rubbing my arm from where he'd grabbed me. It was already starting to feel hot and tender. Concern flashed over Gideon's face as he watched me. Are you hurt? I'm always hurt, I replied, swallowing down my apprehension. How did you find me? We always have eyes on you, Gideon replied easily. Well, that explains a lot, I thought snidely. You weren't obvious about it, were you? Gideon looked at me. No, we were very careful. I've covered your tracks, trust me. He won't be notified, but the reason I'm here is because we need your help. Roran and Kale are mobilizing. We need you to go back. The small hope I had of getting out of this was crushed. I ran a trembling hand through my curly hair, then stuffed it back into my leather jacket, hoping to distract myself. Back. Back to what? To being the Alpha's son, the Primus's heir? To a world crumbling in chaos and decay? Or a life suffocated by rules and regulations that made me long for death? To a man who was as cold as ice, claiming me for warmth, only to freeze me from the inside out? What are you saying? I asked, even though I knew exactly what he was saying. This isn't up for negotiation, Gideon replied, placing a hand on his hip. The Luminal Order will personally see to it that you are arrested, charged for your crimes, and forced to live out your days in a maximum prison. What difference is there when I'm going from one cage to the next? I shot back, my voice trembling. Ezra, I am giving you a chance here. Gideon sounded patient, which was much worse. We know you didn't leave because you were weak. You left because you cared. Do you want to save him, the pack, all the other wolves under his control? Because if you do, this is your shot. You don't know him, what he'll do to me. I breathed hard. You don't understand what he is. How can I go back to him? Nevertheless, Gideon replied, we need you to return to him, as his Omega. Kale will take you back. In fact, we have good information that he's been searching for you too. Your father Roran is still the Packmaster, although he was angry. He still wants you to come home. What you ask for is impossible, I shot back. Can't you see what they'll do to me? What the hell was the point in getting me out of this if you were going to throw me back to the wolves? I was hysterical. Tears were burning my eyes and my blood was quickening in my veins. Gideon got up and sat down right beside me. He pressed his meaty hand to the nape of my neck, trying to calm my nerves. It's all right. Breathe. Please, Ezra. Breathe. I sucked in harsh peals of air and tried to calm down. Go back. Back to him. My Alpha, and then my father, my Packmaster. It was insane. I knocked his hand away and inched back. I watched as Gideon reached into his pocket, pulling out a large folder. It was stamped with the Luminal Order operative sigil, its design unmistakable. The sigil had always intrigued me, an all-seeing eye at its center, radiating beams like a star. Kale is building something massive, tied to a new drug called Exilium. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the Exilium. It looked like liquid opal glowing within, its colors refracting tiny rainbows. I had seen it many times before in the club I worked at, but couldn't place the name of it. It turns wolves human for short periods, Gideon continued, allowing them to relive past and future existences. But the drug's unstable compounds throw the brain into chaos, causing madness. The chemicals overload the wolf's enhanced senses, forcing their minds to process conflicting timelines, leading to cognitive breakdowns, aggression, and hallucinations. The shifts between human and wolf forms destabilize their identity, breaking down neural pathways and driving them to madness. It's a dangerous cocktail that ultimately leads to irreversible mental damage. I was stunned. Growing up, we had never heard of such things, but now that I was in the city, I was seeing more and more. The blanket stares, the walking dead. People whose eyes were glazed over as veins of blue lights lit up every aspect of their skin. It sickened me. And, you think Kale designed this drug? I asked, horrified. Yes, Gideon said. Not only do we think he designed it, we think he is distributing it. The Obsidian Claw Pack resides in the Outlands, so it's been easier for Roran to build a fortress around their cities, and it's almost impossible to infiltrate. We need someone else on the inside. And you think that someone is me? I asked incredulously. You're the Alpha's son, the Primus's mate. Gideon's lip curled as if he were explaining things to a small, stupid child. There can't be anyone but you. Don't you want revenge for what he did to you? The familiar coils of hatred welled inside of me. It was fresh and astonishing as it took possession of me. I thought of Kale's beautiful face, so angular and so pretty, so deceptively calm as he told me my father was disowning me, and that he would be the sole ruler of my thoughts, my will, my whims. That he would take full ownership of me as his mate. That my thoughts on the matter were nothing but a speck of dust in the eyes of a god. And that, by his decree, I would be nothing but his mate. A thing to be kept and bred, a moist hole to fall into and discard just as quickly. I hated him with such passion then, and when he took me that same night, I loved him just as fiercely. Kyle was a hurricane, and I was the shoreline. I can't, I sputtered, backing away from Gideon. I cannot go back to him. I will not. People are in danger, Gideon said, exasperation seeping into his voice. I won't force you, but please think about it. Think about what you'll be doing if we cannot take him down. Both of them. I shook my head frantically, willing the memories to go away. Kale had consumed me. Nobody knew what that was like, for someone to have complete and utter control of you so that you even forgot your own name. I had no standing in the pack. I was nothing but his thing, his creature. They wouldn't listen to me even as the Alpha's son. I was nobody to them. Gideon watched me spiral and sighed, his expression pained but resolute. He had no choice. The Luminal Order would crush the Obsidian Claw Pack no matter the cost. You have 24 hours to think about it. You can die here, or you can join us and destroy the monster you once called Alpha. The ferocity in his eyes startled me. Then again, I was no longer looking at Gideon, the kind beta who had bandaged my wounds after my father had torn into me and helped me mend my broken bones. This was Agent Gideon, ruthless and cunning, and it would be stupid of me to doubt that. He was forged by the fire of the Luminal Order, and I could not forget that fact. I'll protect you, Ezra. If anything goes wrong, I'll yank you out of there so fast they won't know what hit them. But this concerns us all. Exilium is a highly addictive drug, and if left unchecked, it will destroy the world as we know it. I don't think you want that kind of blood on your hands. I smiled ruefully. You don't know what type of blood I have on my hands. Gideon's eyes barreled into mine. Not enough to line the streets, to run through the rivers and valleys like a great vein through the city. That's not the type of blood that you want, Ezra. Believe me. He stood, dropping some money on the table. I'll be in touch, Gideon said, brushing his hand over my mating glands and causing me to shiver. I watched him leave out the front door, his form shrinking and shrinking until it was nothing more than a speck. It seemed now that even though I thought I was free, my thoughts and actions were still not my own, and I would have to return to the Alpha who sucked me dry, and the father that consumed the empty husk I'd become. Chapter 2. Ezra. I can do this. I can do this. Walking back to my apartment, I felt numb. The night air whipped against my cheek. The ice crackled underfoot as the world was plunged into winter's cold embrace. It took me a second to realize I wasn't breathing properly. Each pull of air burned like fire in my lungs as I released puffs of clouds. What's happening to me? I already knew. I pressed my hand to my sternum, as if trying to stop it from cracking open, but Gideon's words had unraveled me and left me unspooled on the concrete floor. The memories come back, fast and rushing, tearing into me with images of Kale's hand on the small of my back, and the leather on his skin from the obsidian clawpack uniforms. A million memories come bursting through my thoughts, dark memories, light memories. Ones of our first claiming, our first mating. Others of hideous fights that lasted for days and days and days. Kyle's face transforms with the raw fury of a beast barely contained, his once serene features twisting into something feral and unrecognizable. Each word he spat carried the weight of his dominance, each blow leaving invisible scars that echoed in my mind long after the physical wounds had faded. Those moments replayed endlessly, haunting the silence with their relentless ferocity. God, I couldn't stand it. Sucking in a deep breath, I forced myself to keep moving, determined not to think about those times. I trudged through the unplowed streets of Dusksong, snow rising over my running shoes and seeping into them with every step. Hugging my flimsy leather jacket tighter, I struggled forward, my feet sticking and sinking deeper into the drifts. Finally, I reached the rundown apartment that was mine. The rickety flight of stairs loomed before me, each step threatening to send me tumbling to my death. At the door, I used the landlord's temperamental key, the one that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. As always, I had to shove my shoulder into the door with the force of a linebacker just to get it open. The scent of old mold and decay was like a slap to the face. As an Omega Primus, my senses were heightened tenfold, and the casual scent of rot always sent my stomach turning. What welcomed me wasn't anything special, and nothing compared to the luxurious house I used to reside in as the Alpha's son. No, Roran would have laughed himself to death if he could see where his son was living now. Yellow splotches dotted the ceiling, spreading like some diseased constellation. The walls, once a faded white, were now smeared with a sickly beige, and the faint tang of mildew hung in the air. I wasn't sure if the gritty residue around the vents was just grime or asbestos slowly poisoning me. The carpet, if you could even call it that, was threadbare and riddled with mysterious stains I didn't dare investigate. The kitchen boasted one working burner and a fridge that wheezed louder than the neighbors' arguments. A single bulb flickered above me, casting weak light that seemed to shiver along with the draft sneaking through the cracked windows. This place wasn't a home, it was a compromise with survival. And I couldn't have been happier. Nobody was breathing down my neck for the first time in my life. There was no talk of mating rituals, endless rules and regulations that left me suffocating by the end of it. There was just me, Ezra. I could breathe here. It wasn't a dungeon, not at all like the obsidian clawpack had been. Kyle wasn't pulling me into his chest with an iron grip, crushing me until I could barely stand, holding on like I was some broken thing he refused to let go. It had been 3 years since I'd been back there. 3 years of blissful silence, 3 years of nothing but the empty company of my own thoughts. Now all of it was coming to an end. I sprinted toward the bathroom, gripping the toilet just in time as bile surged from my throat. My body trembled violently, each spasm rattling my ribs as though they might splinter. The bile was bitter, searing my throat as it splashed into the toilet in a vile shade of acidic yellow-green. My hands clutched the rim, knuckles white as beads of sweat rolled down my clammy skin. Damn it. I flushed the toilet and got up on shaky legs, turning on the faucet. I cupped the water as it fell and drank some of it from my hand, trying to chase the vile taste away. The luminous light flickered overhead, and staring back was a man I barely recognized. A frightened doe, with eyes too large for his face, wide and blue, luminous as most Omega Primuses were. Who was this man? This boy? Who fled from his father and everything he had to offer? And his mate, who abandoned his pack without looking back? Who am I? Death. I dabbed at the puffiness around my eyes, the dark rings of black that never seemed to go away. Looking at myself one last time, I noted the sharp lines of my shirt and how it nearly hung on my body. My shoulders were sharp, my collarbone sticking out, eyes lined with age and stress. Bussing at the club barely afforded this place, but I couldn't get a job doing anything else. My father had seen to that. Seen to the fact that his son remained a humbled idiot. Meant to breed for the alpha and nothing more. I had only been taught the basics in school, and when I left, I had been plunged into a new world. If Gideon hadn't been there, I didn't know if I could have survived. I splashed cold water onto my face and turned off the lights. I woke to the sight of Gideon seated in a chair beside me, clad in the Luminal Order's Navy uniform. The crisp wool beret perched on his head bore the sigil crest, its metallic sheen catching the sunlight that streamed through the window. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, sitting up in bed. Gideon's sharp gaze traced my torso, lingering for a moment on the crisscrossing scars etched into my skin before flicking away. "Come," he said in his usual clipped tone. "Sergeant Victor Dane is waiting." I sighed, dragging myself out of bed and into the shower. The hot water sluiced away the remnants of sleep, and I quickly dressed in a pair of jeans and a plain white t-shirt. As I reached for my battered, mud-stained running shoes, Gideon stood and silently handed me a pair of sleek leather Timberland boots. My cheeks burned, a flush creeping up my neck as a sudden thought struck me. Had he watched me trudging home, my foot sinking embarrassingly into the mud? Avoiding his gaze, I slipped on the boots. They fit perfectly, snug and sturdy. Without a word, I grabbed my coat and followed him out the door. Armed military personnel flanked us as we stepped out, their rifles gleaming under the pale light of the overcast sky. I swallowed hard, glancing nervously at their stern faces and ready stances. Gideon led the way toward a hulking beast of a truck, a monstrous armored Humvee humming with power. The drive was tense, the city blurring past in a haze of steel and snow. As we approached the Luminal Order's compound, its imposing presence came into view. Massive barbed wire gates loomed ahead, their steel coils sharp and menacing, glinting in the sun. Wolves in full military gear patrolled the perimeter, their golden eyes sharp and unyielding, rifles strapped across their chests. I've been here twice, but I swore this would be the last time I ever came back here. Watchtowers punctuated the compound's edges, bristling with mounted weaponry and piercing floodlights that swept across the surroundings. Beyond the gates, the compound sprawled like a fortress, a maze of reinforced concrete buildings, vehicles lined in perfect order, and soldiers drilling with machine-like precision. It felt less like a base and more like a war machine ready to awaken. Gideon led me to the main entrance, his face stoic as we headed to a labyrinth of cubicles until we headed to the main office of Sergeant Victor Dane. The door to Sergeant Victor Dane's office was large and sleek, made of glass, offering an unobstructed view of the Luminal Order compound outside. The room was spacious, dominated by a large desk with several monitors stacked with information. Behind the desk, a wall of glass stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the vast compound below. From here, I could see the training grounds, the vehicles lined up, and the ever-watchful guards stationed at every corner. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the low hum of equipment and the occasional click of a keyboard. The office felt imposing, like everything within its walls was being carefully monitored, just as the compound itself was. I wanted to run, to flee, but Gideon was watching, his dark eyes narrowing into tiny slits the second I breathed too loudly. I gritted my teeth, keeping my eyes fixed on the window. The door opened, and in walked Victor with Celine, and Maeve flanking him. Victor wasn't a large man. Compared to Gideon, he was quite small for an alpha, but the way he commanded the room made him larger than life. I stood, not sure where to put my hands, so they ended up hanging limp and useless at my sides. Victor's black eyes roamed over me, cool and cutting. Assessing. Then again, all the alphas assessed me, tacking in my smooth skin and wide hips. Good for breeding, Swing my father always used to say. Victor looked down his hawkish nose at me and nodded his approval. Good to see you again, Ezra. In one piece this time. I ignored the jab, even though I felt it pierce my underbelly. Likewise. I'm sure Gideon has informed you on what needs to happen next, Victor continued, locking his arms behind his back the way military people always seem to do. He strolled to the window, his silver hair caught in the light beneath his navy beret. These are dangerous times for wolves. I understand, I replied. Victor turned. I don't think you do. But it doesn't matter. You're the only chance we've got in order to take down Roran and Obsidian Clawpack. Loyalty is earned in blood, not words. His eyes fixated on me. Come, you will return to the Obsidian Clawpack at dusk. Panic flared through me. So soon? I wanted to ask and almost reached for him, for anything to stop it from happening. My scent must have curdled because Victor paused, assessing once again. Problem? No, I cleared my throat. I just thought I had more time. Cute. Victor snorted, then walked off with Celine and Maeve right behind him. I stood there for a moment watching, feeling like I was floating out of my body. Gideon's warm hand touched my neck, smoothing over the glands there for a second before he pulled away. Come on, Victor isn't a patient man, Gideon whispered, urging me to step forward. Gideon led me deeper into the complex, the hum of military activity growing louder as soldiers moved in and out, their eyes sharp and purposeful. We passed through heavy metal doors into a vast room that smelled of oil and metal. Rows upon rows of weapons lined the walls, all designed for one singular purpose, to destroy wolves. The harsh gleam of semi-automatic rifles and grenade launchers caught the dim light, a chilling reminder of the brutality that awaited us. We entered the weaponry room, and Celine winked at me playfully while Victor's back was turned. I couldn't help but smile back, though I had no idea what she was up to. Her dark hair was tucked into a low bun behind her beret, but her sharp grin caught my attention as she stepped forward. So first we've got our tracking chips, she said, her light Boston accent making her words sound even more casual. Undetectable, untraceable. In case anything goes wrong, we'll be able to find you. We'll inject it right into your bloodstream. Sound good? Not really. But I nodded, holding out my wrist, and she quickly took out a needle gun, the sharp sting barely registering before she'd already pulled away. Next, my favorite part. Maeve grinned widely. He gestured grandly toward the massive array of weaponry that filled the room. Weapons! Now, they didn't exactly give me much runway. He shot a mock glare at Gideon. But what we've got is sick, yo. Trust me, check this out. He pulled a small bead from his pocket and held it out. I call them dynamite marbles. You roll them and they explode. You'll use these once you find out where they're keeping Exilium. Just roll one and boom. A hole in the door, trips the alarm, and bam, we come rushing in to save the day. I stared at him, wide-eyed. You want me to walk around with tiny bombs all day? He shrugged nonchalantly. Why not? They won't go off unless you roll them, or drop them. Just don't do anything with them, and you'll be fine. I raised an eyebrow. Comforting, I said dryly, crossing my arms. Maeve grinned even wider. See? Nothing to worry about. These weapons are meant to aid you, Victor chimed in, his expression stern. Don't think too much about it. We'll be sending 2 troops alongside you in case you run into problems. Troops? I frowned. What do you mean? Victor's gaze hardened. Did you honestly think we'd let you go alone? Exilium is poisoning our streets, and the death mortality rate for wolves is through the roof. He stepped closer. This isn't just about a mission, he continued. The Luminal Order was built to destroy threats like this. We were forged to eliminate things that fester in the darkness and tear apart the fabric of society. Exilium is one of those things. It's a poison, not just in the blood of wolves, but in the very core of our existence. And we will eradicate it. Victor stared through me. And you are the only person who can do it. Me? I sputtered. I'm a nobody. Please, I don't know if I can. I'm not built for this. I felt Gideon's hand smooth down my spine, lingering there for a moment. I took in a deep breath and tried to calm down. I didn't ask for any of this. It doesn't matter what you asked for. What matters is what is. Victor growled. Prove yourself. Show us you're worthy. If you can't, you'll be nothing more than another casualty of this war. And we don't have the luxury of casualties. Not anymore. Victor jerked his head, and everybody in the room started mobilizing. The conversation was over. Loyalty is earned in blood, not words. The words made my stomach turn, but they were already pushing me to the end of the compound and out the front door. I turned to Gideon, my throat tight with the words I couldn't say. The Arctic wind whipped my curly brown hair into my eyes as I tried to steady myself. We had arrived. On the borderlands of the Obsidian Clawpack, the weight of what lay ahead crushed me. My stomach churned violently, a pit of dread opening up. I shoved the nausea down, trying not to let it take hold. Through the trees, the wall rose before me like an ancient beast, its jagged edges clawing at the sky. The fortress stood tall, an unforgiving monument to everything I had fought to escape. The walls, twisted and dark, seemed to breathe with a life of their own, reaching for the heavens like fingers from the earth. I didn't want to be here. I couldn't do it. Tears threatened to blur my vision, and I choked on the emotion clawing at my chest. "Please," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the rush of wind. "Don't make me go back there." Gideon stared down at me. His mask was cold, unreadable. He didn't have to say anything. Celine broke the silence between us. "This will be the last time we see you for a while, Ezra," she said. "Be strong." She squeezed my shoulder and headed back into the armed truck. Maeve patted my back and followed suit, but only Gideon remained. He stood for a moment, then tucked a stray curl behind my ear, his eyes just as unreachable as the stars. "Good luck." Then he was gone. I swallowed hard, my gaze fixed on the mountainous terrain ahead, the harsh rocks and snow stretching as far as I could see. The Obsidian Clawpack's stronghold sat atop these jagged peaks, isolated from the world below. Cars and trucks couldn't make it up here. Only wolves could reach the gates. But I didn't shift. I zipped up my thin winter coat and started the long trek up the mountain, my new boots sinking into the deep snow with every step. I needed the clarity of the cold air and the silence of the wilderness, the emptiness that came with being utterly alone. Tears had long since frozen on my cheeks. I used to love these fields, these lands. I used to love it when my mother would take me here, shifting into her white wolf, running beside her as she tore across the endless plains. But Roran had shattered all of that, tore it away from me and burned it to the ground. Now, I was returning to him, the prodigal son. When I finally reached the top, dusk had already fallen, the sun setting in a velvet sky streaked with tangerine. I gazed up at the towering wooden gates, feeling like nothing more than an insect beneath their shadow. It was unnervingly quiet. No sentries, no movement, no torches flickering on the walls. It wasn't right. My hands were frozen stiff, and though I was a wolf, hours spent in the snow in my human form still took their toll. The gates creaked open slowly, groaning like a soft wail in the wind. A tall figure emerged, the unmistakable broad shoulders and lean frame making my breath catch in my throat. Before I knew it, I was staring up into Cale's stony face. "Ezra, you've finally come back to me." Chapter 3. Ezra. He didn't touch me. Not at first. He kept a safe distance away, weaving through the massive crowds that had gathered at the front of the city gates. He wore the ceremonial cloak of Seraphael, a long navy blue garment that swept the ground behind him. Glowing runes lined the back, pulsing softly like trapped light. His pure white hair trailed down his back, flowing like strands of silver under the faint glow of the runes. Cale's muscular arms were covered in dark tattoos, curling and twisting lines of ink that were carved into his skin. A plain white shirt stretched across his broad chest, which was an odd choice for the biting cold, but then again, Primus Alphas ran the hottest in terms of body temperature. His worn beige pants were tucked into rugged boots, his strides were long and purposeful. "Altus!" A wolf strutted towards him and stopped when his eyes landed on me. Drake gave me a dismissive once-over before turning back to the Alpha. "We have a breach near the border. Talon from the Bloodspire Pack seeks an audience with you and will not be turned away again." The Bloodspire Pack? Why would they be seeking an audience with Kyle and not my father, the Packmaster? I shoved my hands into my pocket, curious now as to what Kyle was going to do. Kyle angled his head, his gaze assessing for a moment, and I noticed his hair had grown much longer since the last time we'd spoken. It was still the same pure white and hung like brittle veins of frost, translucent and unyielding, as though death itself had woven strands of its decay into a cruel tapestry. "I will meet him presently," Kyle said, then his eyes cut to me. "Gear up. We leave in 20 minutes. Surely he didn't mean for me to do this. I blinked at him in disbelief, quickly masking my reaction before turning toward my assigned quarters. The stone cottages around us seemed like relics from another era, their ancient, weathered exteriors blending with the harsh landscape. Snow mixed with mud clung stubbornly to my boots as I trudged the familiar path, my mind detached from my body. I avoided the silent glances cast my way, each gaze heavy with unspoken judgment. Behind me, Cale followed at an unhurried pace, his steps deliberate and measured. It was as though he refused to let me stray even a single step out of his sight. The mansion stood tall on the hill, its dark stone walls looming like a fortress. It was too big for just my father and me. As I made my way up the familiar path, the overgrown trees and gardens seemed frozen in time, a place where we'd once run and played. My heart twisted with each step, the memories threatening to overwhelm me. I couldn't bring myself to look at Kyle, his presence heavy behind me. Inside, the air was cold, and a group of servants quickly surrounded me, their faces impassive as they worked. They stripped me of my worn leather jacket and boots, their touch firm but distant. Cale stood in the background, watching with unsettling eyes. I felt my face grow hot beneath his pulsating gaze as he took in my body for the first time in a long time. It was a little chilly. They washed my body and cleaned it of all the dirt and grime, and one of the servants gave me a brief examination. "He has not been touched," the servant said, keeping his eyes low. It was hard to ignore the heat flaring in Cale's eyes, and he nodded at them to continue. When they finished, I was dressed in ceremonial robes, dark cloth embroidered with glowing runes. A butcher's knife was strapped to my thigh, and a long cape flowed around me, its magic tied to the ancient power of Seraphael's tomb. It wasn't until all the servants were dismissed that I realized my mistake. Kyle loomed over me, his face a perfect mask, but beneath it, I could see he was a simmering pot of resentment. The malice was overflowing like liquid lava. The shape of Kyle's eyes was almost feline, narrow, slightly upturned, and glowing with an unsettling yellow fire. Kyle laughed, a hideous scraping sound, and all his faux calm was obliterated, showing his true monstrous form. I took a step back, but he wrenched me forward, the grip on my bicep bruising. "You've come back to me." "Altus," a voice said from behind the shut door, and I shuddered in relief when I realized it was Drake again. Talon is losing his patience. Cale sighed through his nose and released me. He almost tore the door off its hinges when he opened it and stormed out. I touched my bicep, my fingers running over the area where his claws had dug in, and it came away wet with blood. My breath was shaky as I grabbed a cloth, wiped the blood immediately, and headed after them. Kyle stomped forward while Drake and I flanked him, guiding us down to the west gate where hordes of other wolves were gathered, waiting for their command. Kyle speared through them like parting the Red Sea, his strides quick and purposeful as we all went out the back. "Ezra?" a voice whispered. "He's back?" another replied. "No way," another voice said. "What does the traitor want now?" another asked. I ignored the tittering as their voices prickled over my skin. The large wooden gates groaned open, the sound echoing like the creaking of old bones. Beyond them, a vast field stretched out, shrouded in a ghostly mist that clung to the ground. I squinted, trying to make out shapes through the fog, and saw 3 lone figures emerging from it. The largest of them had shifted, their massive wolf form looming like a shadow, eclipsing the sun. The Bloodspire pack had long been peaceful with our pack, but as we drew nearer I could see Talon pacing, his red, sleek robe bustling in the winds, his long black hair flying behind him like a flag. He looked disturbed. His eyes were lined with wrinkles and his face ashen. "Kyle, you son of a—" he seethed. "How the hell can you—" He stopped dead when he saw me. "Ezra?" "Luminous." Is that you? A familiar wave of panic darted through me. I thought of the pain throbbing in my arm, the crazed look in Cale's eyes earlier. Help me. Save me. I wanted to close the distance and leap into Talon's awaiting arms and beg him to take me away from this place, from this monster. The Bloodspire pack were of my mother's kin. I knew their lands just as well as my own. Talon stepped forward, his arms outstretched as if I were to jump and he would catch me, but so did Cale. He stepped in front of me, blocking me from his view. What do you want? Speak quickly. I am a busy man, Kyle responded. A traitorous bastard, you mean? Talon spat. Where is Roran? It's been half a year since I've spoken with him. Why are we forced to deal with you? Where is the Packmaster? Shock jolted through me and I turned to Cale. No wonder my father did not come to meet me at the gate. Where was he? A shrinking horror made the hairs on my arm bristle. Come now, Talon, Cale said, a smile curling his lips. You didn't come all this way just to talk to me about Roran. Talon huffed. You bastard, of course I didn't. Each day your wolves grow bolder and bolder, breaching our territory, inching closer and closer until they reach the heart of it. They patrol the outlands, as per our pack agreement, Kyle replied. It isn't my fault they get too close and stray further than their borders. You know damn well your patrolling cuts right through our lands. Talon fumed. He was so angry his face was red. How dare you? Take me to the Packmaster, or let me speak with the one actually in charge. Ezra is back now, so it seems. I will speak to him at once. You will speak with no one. Kyle's eyes flashed a warning. Talon sucked air between his teeth, his expression of disbelief. You have taken the throne for yourself and called yourself Atlas. It is Ezra's by right. He is the Alpha's son. And Ezra is mine. I am his Alpha, therefore. All he has belongs to me, Kyle replied coldly. Now, if you have nothing to discuss— Nothing to discuss! Talon threw his head back and laughed bitterly. Even now, as you breach our borders and take our lands, you still dismiss me. As you desecrate Serphael's grounds and statues, you treat me like dirt beneath your feet. Damn you, weasel! Who sat at your master's table, coveting his riches and gold? You were nothing but a dog when Roran picked you up from the streets, and now that dog has decided to show his teeth and claws. Careful, Talon, Kyle replied, his eyes burning with the intensity of a dying star. I haven't even begun. Ezra, come with me, Talon pleaded. We will protect you. Your mother was my kin, the blood of my sister's sister. Come with us. My heart lurched, and I stepped forward before I was conscious of it, but Kyle was already grabbing my arm and pulling me back. God, I could have wept then. Enough, Cale snarled. I will hear no more of this foolishness. Return to what's left of your pack, Talon, before I see you removed from it. Talon's lips rippled over his canines. Is that what you did with Roran? With the councilmen? What have you done with them? Where are the old wolves? The centurions to Seraphael's shrines? Or have you destroyed them all in your lust for power? Kyle's face transformed. His hand shot out and clamped around Talon's thick throat. A sickening crunch rang out as he began lifting the old man high into the air while he sputtered and kicked, thrashing beneath Cale's crushing hold. Cale's eyes bled yellow, and a fierce snarl erupted from his chest. The other wolves sprung into action, baring their teeth, each of them jumping into a fighting stance. No! I found my voice. No! I grabbed Cale's bicep. Stop it. Listen to your mate, Talon wheezed. You don't want to start a war with me. And you don't want to start a war with me either, Kyle growled. Talon laughed, but it was strained, like the sound of a man grasping for breath. You're a plague, sent from the depths of hell, a mongrel with no honor. You're the one spreading exilium among our wolves, driving them to madness. His voice rose, fury burning in his words. Kill me, Cale, go ahead. But know this, if you don't, I'll come back, and I'll slaughter you. He was going to kill him. I could see it in his eyes, the vein throbbing on his forehead. Panic shot through me, my heart slamming against my ribs as I scrambled to think of something, anything to stop him. Everyone was moving, the wolves inching forward, their jaws filled with razor-sharp teeth. To my left, I saw Drake reach for his knife, his eyes glowing yellow with the intent to strike. Centuries of peace, the legacy my father fought for, were crumbling to dust. For what? Frantically, I looked back up at Kale, hoping for some sign that the man I once knew was still inside, that the wolf hadn't consumed him. Lifting my hand, a soft blue glow emanated from my fingers as I raised it to his forehead. For the first time in 3 years, I reached into the bond between us and touched his wolf. Kyle flinched as if I'd struck him, his eyes widening in shock as he stared down at me. The world seemed to fall away, and the sounds around me blurred as I saw deep into his soul. His wolf was there, hunched over, shackled, and bound by chains. What? My heart lurched as I stared at its sickly form. Ugly blue runes marked its body, and I realized, with a start, that its glow was eerily similar to that of Exilium. Kyle bared his teeth and shoved me away. I staggered back, my head spinning from the contact, finally touching him, feeling his inner soul after so long, and then being cast away. I fell fast, crashing to the ground, but strong arms caught me and yanked me back up. Kale was breathing hard, nostrils flaring, his brow glistening with sweat. Talon released a painful yelp as he was dropped to the ground. He scrambled back, his eyes bulging. "Get away from him, Ezra!" Oh no. Kale's face twisted in agony, a snarl ripping from his chest as he fought against the shift. I was standing too close. If he fully transformed into his wolf form, he'd kill me. His muscles contorted, skin rippling beneath like popcorn, his body fighting to break free. Do it. I thought, succumbing to him. End this. It was almost as if he heard my thoughts because he froze and wrangled the wolf back into submission. Kyle set me on my feet and smoothed his hand over his white hair. He took a shaky breath, clearing his throat. "Return to your pack, Talon. I won't ask again." Talon stiffened, his body going rigid as he desperately fought against the Primus Alpha command, but it was no use. His legs trembled, and his jaw snapped with rage as his body was forced to step back, retreating with each movement like he was no longer in control until he was pushed all the way back to his camp. Kyle grabbed my wrist and marched back to camp. I was breathing hard as we made our way through the crowds. People were watching us, staring. I kept my head held high, but inside I was shaking. Every word Talon had spoken rattled me to my core. Where was my father? Where were the old councilmen? The centurions of Seraphael's secret tomb? Why had they not come when I arrived? Was there mutiny? If so, was Kale at the helm? The thought froze the blood in my veins. Kale led me back to the house, slamming all the doors shut. He paced the floor, his face manic and wild as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. It was a look I wasn't familiar with anymore and hadn't been for 3 years. So much has changed, so many horrible things have happened since I left, and a part of me wanted to flee the area right now. "Roran is safe," Kale said, although he still continued to pace. "I don't want you to worry about that." Worry? Was what I was feeling worry for my father? The man who tried to kill me? My lips thinned into a hard line. "I wouldn't—" Kale's words broke apart. "I wouldn't hurt him. Not if you didn't wish it." "And if I did?" "Wish it," I replied, my voice deceptively soft. Several emotions flickered over Kale's face at once before it smoothed out. "Then I'd crush him." I released a breath I didn't realize I was holding, staring at him. Over the years, I could see where he'd changed. The lines around his mouth were deeper, cutting into his skin. Drake was still by his side, and I wondered about the others, the ones who I'd grown up with and abandoned all at once. There was too much to think about. I was exhausted. "Leave me alone. I'm tired." "Alone?" Kyle snorted, then crowded my space. "You don't get to be alone, not after the stunt you pulled." "And whose fault is that?" I glared up at him. "Leave me alone, Kale." "Hell no," Kale spat. "You come back after 3 years, stinking of another beta, and you think I'll leave you alone. Where have you been? Why did you just leave without a word? Don't you know what happened after you left? I would have protected you." "Like you did against Roran?" I replied, my temper flaring. I did not want to talk about that night. I could not relive it again with Kyle. He reached for me but stopped when he saw the anger on my face, and he let out a bitter laugh. "So, you haven't come back to me. This is another one of your stupid tricks, your stupid games." His nostrils flared. "Get the Primus Alpha to fall in love with you again, and then what? Kill him." I flinched back from his words, cowering. "Leave me alone, Kyle." 3 years. Kyle advanced on me. 3 freaking years you've been gone and I searched. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to face him. I searched high and low, scavenging the area. Do you want to know why we breached their lands? Why we tear across their cities regardless of the treaties? My fingers trembled uncontrollably, the sensation of cold, clammy skin crawling up my arm like 1,000 tiny spiders. My mind screamed at me to move, but the paralysis took hold, locking me in place as the air thickened with a stench of decay that filled my lungs. I shook my head. "Don't." "It was because of you," Kale hissed. "Because I could not find you. My mate." "Kale," I rasped, "let me go." He did, and I all but collapsed onto the ground. Kale stared down his nose at me, his gaze narrowing into pinpricks. "You will remain here, in this room, until I determine if or not you're a threat. You will go nowhere without me, and you will see no one. Understood?" Hatred filled me to the brim. Kale snarled. He tore out of the room like a hurricane and slammed the door shut so hard it splintered right down the middle. Chapter 4. Ezra. There was no part of me that wished to be here, in the sanctuary of pain. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking and thinking, wishing and wishing, until everything turned to despair. Cal would not set me free. Not even when the Luminal Order burst through the front gates and Gideon came, riding his armored truck like a chariot, the army blazing in the night behind him, would Kale ever set me free. Even as we all stood in the wasteland of smoldering ashes that once was Obsidian Clawpack, he would not set me free. I shuddered thinking about it. The fear unraveled me once more. Images of my body lying broken and twisted in the river flashed before my eyes, and I stamped down the scream clawing up my throat. I turned onto my side and went to sleep. I awoke the next day feeling worse. My body ached from all of Kale's yanking and pulling, the vicious words he branded into my skin. I showered and got changed. The servants came in shortly after and tidied the room, and I forced myself not to look around or stare at the closet that held all of Kale's clothing. He didn't come in last night. Where did he sleep? Should I care? I found that I didn't. Not particularly. I walked down the winding staircase, my fingertips brushing the cold metal balusters, each rail smooth yet bitter to the touch like forgotten memories. The mansion groaned under its own weight, the walls sagging with secrets, its grandeur now a crumbling facade. At the bottom of the stairs I stopped. 3 jagged claw marks marred the wall, the plaster peeling away like dead skin. My fingers trembled as they traced the jagged edges. I jerked my hand away and kept walking. Kyle was nowhere to be found, and I was alone in this big house, the horror of 4 walls, lost in the past. I wanted to flee. I started walking quickly then, my heart pounding, but before I reached the door, Drake stepped in my way. "Altus has not permitted you to leave," Drake said, his voice calm and cold. "I was just getting some fresh air," I gritted out. "Surely that should be okay with him." I shoved past Drake and opened the door. A brisk wind cut into my cheek, and I tore down the winding pathway, heading straight to the gardens with Drake hot on my heels. I ignored him, too busy trying not to scream. This place was a cage, an ugly, haunting cage, and Kale was the bars and the jailer. I kept walking, not caring that I was barely dressed, and the wind kept cutting against my skin. I moved with the single purpose of trying not to feel anything, not to see anything. I rounded the bend and collided head-on with a servant. They stumbled, and we both tumbled onto the grass in a mess of limbs. "I'm sorry, My breath hitched. Gideon. His black hair flopped over his brown eyes, his 5 o'clock shadow unshaven. He was dressed as a soldier. Before I could speak, he pressed a finger to his lips, his gaze darting toward Drake, who was coming around the corner. Gideon scrambled to his feet, brushing off his clothes. "I apologize, Luminous," he said quickly, keeping his tone low and respectful, though his eyes burned with urgency. He was the one they planted here? Who else? Why didn't he say anything? Hot tears of relief burned my eyes, and I stood too, wishing I could talk to him, to tell him all that I had seen and heard yesterday, so that he could get me out of here. "You've gone too far," Drake was spitting mad. "Come back now. Who's this?" Drake gave Gideon a cool once-over. "Get back to your post." "Yes, sir." Gideon bowed and hurried off. What the hell was he going all the way out here? Drake grumbled and shook his head like he didn't want to know. "Anyway, Kyle will be back soon. Why don't you head back inside the house?" "I would like to see the shrines of Serfael," I said quickly. Drake messaged his brow as if a massive headache were coming on, and then he snorted. His pale green eyes snapped to mine. "Fine, this way, Luminous." Luminous. Oh, how that name scorched my soul. It was meant to be light or essence, but I was anything but that. Roran saw to that. I turned away from him, striding quickly toward the shrines of Seraphael, hidden beyond the towering wall of emerald evergreens and deeper into the enchanted forest. The air felt heavy as I approached, a strange stillness settling over the path. When I reached the shrine, my steps faltered. I stared in shock at the dilapidated ruins. The once luminous statue of Seraphael was now dim, its glow extinguished. Carved from granite, the Omega's sleek form remained beautiful, robes twining around narrow hips, hands outstretched, and 3 flames circling his head like a crown. But the flames flickered weakly, barely holding on. I rushed forward, my heart pounding. How could this be? What had happened? Where were the sentries who maintained the shrine? Was Talon right? Had Kale driven them away? I placed my hand on the soapstone base, feeling a faint warmth, distant and waning. My chest tightened. What the hell had Kale done? "Are you finished?" I jumped, whirling around. Kyle stood there, his navy blue cape billowing in the wind while strands of his silver hair escaped its updo knot. His face was carefully blank, his feline eyes sharpening into slits. For a moment, I was taken aback by his beauty. Even though he was hard as iron, Kyle Vale was said to be mixed with fey blood. His features were so fine, so delicate they looked almost ethereal. Most wolves knew he wasn't full-blooded, hence why Talon had called him a bastard. I remembered when he first came here, a brittle broken boy with sticks for arms and legs, but a primus nonetheless. My father had sought to use him like he does all beautiful things and transformed him into the monster who stands before me. The runes on his cape were lit up, glowing faintly, and I noticed he was dressed for battle. Had Talon returned as he promised? Or had something else happened? "Kale," I said, my voice shaky. "What happened? Where are the banquet will start soon. You must get dressed." He turned to walk away, but I ran in front of him, blocking his path. "What the hell is going on? Where are the sentries? Where is my father?" "Now you want to start asking questions?" Kyle uttered. "Well, it's too little too late, don't you think? Put your hatred for me aside for once." I snapped at him. "Where is everyone?" "What happened?" "What happened was you left," Kale hissed. "You don't get to ask questions. Now get dressed. Everyone will be gathering soon." He stormed around me, leaving me standing there gaping after him. I watched his strides. His back was straight and ridged, his head held high, but something about his wolf set me on edge. His wolf was in a cage, locked away. But how? My head was spinning and I felt like I was wandering around in circles. How could any of this be? The sentries had looked after Sephael's shrine for decades. My father would never dismiss them. Then again, I had no idea where the Packmaster was. Nobody did, it seemed. Did it have something to do with why Kale's wolf was caged? I sighed, then followed Kale back to the house. I wouldn't get my answers by standing here. I'd have to wait and see what happened next. The banquet hall stretched out before me, vast and grand, but something was wrong. I wore Seraph's ceremonial robes, the weight of them heavy on my shoulders, and the 3 blue flames of the crown flickered softly above my head. My stomach churned, unease twisting in my gut as I glanced at Kale. He stood beside me, his body rigid, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a look of distaste. The hall was nothing like it used to be. In the center, dancers moved in slow, awkward steps, their colorful robes swirling half-heartedly. They were trying, but their performance lacked the spark and joy it once had. Around the walls, soldiers stood stiff and silent, their presence oppressive. Commanders whispered in low voices, glancing toward the head table. This wasn't how it was meant to be. My father would never have allowed soldiers to line these walls, not here. Food and wine were served generously. My plate was filled with my favorites, parsley, fresh greens, and creamy avocados. But I could see the murmuring in the distance, the ripple of their dissatisfaction. "Are you still a vegetarian?" Kyle asked, his mouth curling in disgust. I swallowed. "Not anymore," I replied. 6 months of starving on the streets banished that idea out of my head. Kyle looked at me. "Really?" He signaled for the servants to bring in some meat. "What happened?" "You don't look like you eat meat. You look more emancipated than ever before." "Thanks," I deadpanned. "No. Just been there, done that." Kyle snorted. "I remember you used to get so outraged when Roran forced you to eat it, you'd feed it to the dogs secretly." I smiled ruefully. Little did I know the dog would soon have a seat at my father's table after being fed scraps. Kale's smile somehow thinned and deepened at the same time. "Cute. I forgot how cute you were. Like a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum. I applaud your skill." "I applaud yours," I responded, not missing a beat. "It's amazing how you managed to make a banquet look more like a military expedition than an actual feast." "One of my many talents, I assure you," Kyle replied, sipping his wine. "Although I haven't mastered the act of disappearing into thin air, but I'm positive that secret will be revealed when the time comes." I gritted my teeth. "Too bad it isn't working now, or else I would have gone poof already." Kyle bristled beside me, and I ignored the sour stench of his alpha's scent, looking around the room. The people were well fed, it seemed. None of them looked like they were suffering. Most were pink and plump, talking amidst one another as if they were used to having the soldiers around during supper. Still. I scanned the room, and my eyes landed on Gideon, who was standing ramrod straight with the other soldiers. Desperately flared inside me, and I wanted to go to him, to talk to him. Excuse me." I was on my feet before I even registered it, the thin robes trailing behind me. Everyone stood the second I did, some of the servants bowing, but I disregarded them all and made a beeline toward a secluded room near the back where I knew Gideon would meet me. The ceremonial robes of Seraph were breathtaking, elegant, and ethereal. The tunic, a soft baby blue, clung gently to the body, its fabric shimmering faintly as if kissed by starlight. A long, sweeping cape trailed behind, trimmed with silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement. The crown of flames rested above my head, glowing from the very essence of my soul, casting a warm golden hue around me. I had taken only a few steps when Gideon yanked my arm, pulling me into a nearby room and slamming the door. His breath came fast as he pressed me against the wall. "Are you okay?" he asked urgently. "Did he hurt you?" "No, I'm fine." I paused, looking up at him. "What are you doing here? I thought you said they would send someone." "Yeah, me," Gideon replied. "Victor thought it would be best if you didn't know who it was," he explained. "I'm sorry for all the secrecy, but it's better that way. Celine and Maeve are here with me too, so look out for them." He shoved a cell phone into my hand. "In case you need to call me, but press the star key and I'll come find you with the tracking device." "Okay," I nodded. There were faint noises outside. "Gideon, I saw—" "Not here," he said quickly. We'll talk soon. Try to get away from him if you can. Come to visit the soldiers at the barracks and we can meet, okay? When? Tonight. Slip out if you can. I'm new here, and I don't want to draw any suspicion. Be careful. He's watching you, Gideon whispered. Then he was gone, slipping out the front door and shutting it softly behind him. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. As I reached for the door, it swung open, and I froze. Kyle stood there, his imposing figure filling the doorway. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and I flinched under his piercing gaze. His eyes narrowed into slits. "What are you doing in there?" he demanded. Nothing. I just wanted some privacy," I stammered, my voice shaky. Kyle arched a brow, unconvinced. "Come on, your food's getting cold." We returned to the banquet. I pushed the food around on my plate but couldn't eat. My eyes lingered on the dancers and guests, noting how everything seemed normal, as if their packmaster wasn't missing. It unsettled me. Later, Kyle walked me back to the mansion, his face stony and his lips pressed into a thin line. He bid me good night and stalked off. I rolled my eyes at his retreating figure before heading to my room. When the clock struck midnight, I climbed out the window, landing softly in the backyard. I pressed the star key on my phone and found a secluded spot on the grounds. 10 minutes later, Gideon emerged from the shadows, still wearing his soldier's uniform. "You weren't followed?" he asked, his voice low as he approached. "No," I whispered. "What's going on? What did you find out?" "Not much," Gideon replied. "Kale keeps everyone on a tight leash. I need to get close to him in order to find out what he's planning. That's where you come in." "Me?" "No, someone else." Gideon rolled his eyes. "Seriously, stop acting so surprised when I ask you to do your job. It's annoying." "I'm not sure how you expect me to react," I hissed at him. "You guys just threw me into this position." "For the greater good," Gideon replied. "Now listen, you need to get close to Kale. Why isn't he sharing your bed? Aren't you his Omega?" A sharp flare of indignation bristled through me. How close are we talking? Should I be asking him about the pack secrets while I have his shaft down my throat? "If that would help, sure," Gideon shrugged. "Look, by any means necessary. I'm sorry you have to go through this again, but the rate at Exilium is spreading is alarming. I see several armed trucks leave the Obsidian Clawpack warehouse, but it's almost impossible to see where they are going. It's like they disappear into thin air. I need to either get close myself, or I need you to get closer. Kyle would be suspicious at first, but you are still the Luminous, the Pack's Primus Omega. He won't question it after a while." I sighed through my nose. "Fine. I'll see what I can do." "Thank you," Gideon said, then smiled at me. "Cheer up. It's not all doom and gloom. I know things are difficult now, but I'll protect you, Ezra. You have my word." I wet my dry lips and looked away from him. "Sure." Gideon ruffled my hair. "Try to get some sleep, okay? We'll talk soon, I promise." I watched as he fled back into the safety of the shadows and huffed a long breath. Then I realized with a start I forgot to tell him all the information I knew about Talon and what was said, but I guess we'd have to wait for that later. Right now, I needed to focus on getting closer to Kale, a task that felt like opening an artery, one that would bleed rivers of blood.
Chapter 5. Kyle. "We found him," Drake said, handing me a beige folder. I tensed when Ezra's face came into view, enlarged pictures of him climbing the wicked terrain in nothing but a flimsy leather jacket, even though it was the dead of freaking winter. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the rage flaring through me. It was just so... Ezra. To forget himself and his surroundings. To just move without thinking. To be one with the earth by any means necessary. I used to find it all enduring. But I have long since passed that phase of finding anything Ezra did now as enduring. I was half convinced the Omega was on a mission to stress me to death by the number of times he went outside without shoes or a coat, without any sense of how bitterly cold the winters were in the obsidian claw pack. My throat dry clicked at his skinny arms. They were thinner than the last time I'd seen him, after Rorin. No, I couldn't go there. That night had been branded into my retina, seared into my vision, and by the flames of Seraph, did I want Rorin to burn alive for what he'd done to my Omega. I swallowed around the pain gathering within me and took a slow, deep breath. Ezra's blue eyes were fixed in the distance. I could almost see his rosebud mouth trembling, his hands clenched into fists in his pocket. The wind had blown his curly mocha hair wildly as he walked toward the gates. My eyes flitted to what I was actually looking for, and there in the shadows was a man, not far behind, dressed in casual clothing, stalking Ezra's footsteps. Ezra couldn't tell. The Omega had been blissfully unaware of the terror that haunted his footsteps, of the creeping insect in the shadows. That same man had joined our ranks, and 2 more unidentified wolves had followed. I wasn't a fool. I knew an organized attack when I saw it, but the obsidian clawpack wolves were ready. They had long ago gone weary of newcomers, even though I kept with the old ways and welcomed them, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but very few proved their worth or their trustworthiness. But something about this wolf set my teeth on edge. Usually, Ezra wasn't so careless in his surroundings. With the blood of Seraphiel running through his veins, he should be able to sense a lone wolf, but it seemed there might be something amiss here. Either Ezra didn't know he was being followed, or he knew the wolf in question. It took everything in me not to shred the photo to pieces. Ezra had been gone a long time. 3 years. What was 3 years to a Primus Omega? There were so few out there that most Primus Alphas went mad with lust at first sight. I'd know because I had. I'd been a runt, a mongrel with questionable origins mixed with fey and wolf blood when I'd come to the obsidian clawpack. Nobody wanted me. Until Rorin did. He looked at me, assessed me, and turned me into a weapon. A soldier. A monster. It didn't matter because I was his creature. I lived in the master's house, ate at the master's table, so much so that people started to suspect that maybe I was Rorin's bastard child. However, all of that was disputed when I got older, and my hair, which I usually kept cropped short, started growing like a weed. Silver-white strands, pointy ears, and sharp canines were all signature features of the Fae. There was no mistaking it. I was Fae, and a wolf. The largest they'd ever seen, towering over the regular wolves, a grotesque, sickly thing that stood on its hind legs, with ice antlers that stretched like twisted metal into the sky. The first time I had shifted, Rorin had stared at me in horror, but then a slow smile slithered over his face, and he took me into his arms and hugged me tightly. I loved him too, like the mother and father that I never had, and he loved me. He showed me all the ways of the pack and raised me to be the pack's alpha. Ezra had been too young at the time, and he lived mostly with his mother in the Bloodspire pack, but when Rorin called them back, things shattered for me. I met Ezra. For the first time in 10 years, he was 16 and I was 18. A slip of a thing, tall and lithe, radiant. They said his mother was Seraph's vessel, and she had birthed Ezra right there at the foot of his shrine, screaming to the god in agony. Ezra was the first Primus Omega the obsidian clawpack had in over a century. Ezra looked at me, and I held him with my eyes closed, and crushed him to me. Since then, I could not stay away from me. My lust had grown ravenous, and Rorin had watched it all. I did everything to prove myself. I patrolled. I fought other wolves. I fought Rorin's wars, decimated other packs. All for this, a reward. I became the strongest alpha, the most revered in all of the 5 packs, and Rorin made good on his promise. He'd given Ezra to me on my 21st birthday. Ezra had been 19. Not many Omegas could take my knot. Most would have been screwed to death. And gods, his greedy hole had gobbled me up. By Seraph's burning light I saw the heavens, the stars, the earth, the sea. It was as if time had opened up to us and we had fallen through it. I'd like to think we were happy then, that Ezra was happy with me. But then the wars came. Altus, Drake's voice brought me back to the present. Find out who he is and bring him to me. I snarled, then thrust the folder back into his awaiting hands. Talon? He waits in limbo, Drake reported. But don't underestimate him. The Stormcrest pack is still upset you've trampled all over their territory, and if they align themselves with the Bloodspire pack, we'd have a big freaking problem. Then please remind Kethar of the Stormcrest pack whose land he resides on, and who rules the 5 clans as packmaster, while Rorin is resting. Altus, Drake saluted, then paused for a moment. Was there something else? I asked, turning to him. Exilium. Drake kept his voice low. The people grow anxious, Altus. They say Rorin has been gone too long. We trust your word, but with the council also missing. I know the situation, but perhaps you could go to them and shed some light on their whereabouts. In due time, Drake, I replied, waving him off. Where is Luminous? Drake visibly struggled to hold back his sigh. In the gardens, Altus. Again? My mouth curled into a frown. Yes, he's been spotted wandering most days, whispering to himself sometimes. He's not what I remember. Thinner, hollowed out. I don't know what happened to him in those 3 years, but he doesn't look like the Luminous we've come to know and love. My thoughts exactly, I agreed, then walked over to the fireplace. The office seemed alive with quiet dignity. The mahogany desk, broad and commanding, stood like a sentinel in the center of the room, its surface gleaming with the reflection of the flickering firelight. The fireplace muttered and hissed, its flames casting warm, shifting patterns onto the polished wood. The bookshelves loomed high along the walls, their rows of spines like sentinels guarding centuries of wisdom. The light of Seraph has weakened in him. Do you think so? Drake gasped. I sense it. I lifted my hand, and a blue light exploded in my palm. But I don't know why he's returned so diminished. It unsettles me. I stared into the blazing blue fire and then extinguished it. There'd be time to find out later. For now, it was best to see that Ezra got some proper food in him. It was strange during the banquet I had picked all the fresh vegetables, all the foods he used to love when he was here, making sure they'd been carefully washed and arranged on his plate, but he barely touched it. I'll brew him his favorite chicken broth. Maybe that should help, I said, offering Drake a tight smile. Drake cocked his head. You should tell him you cooked for him, he sighed. I can't believe how much time passes, but things still stay the same. Even when you were mates, Ezra never knew the food you brought to him was handmade and cooked by... What about the soldiers? I cut him off, not ready to go down memory lane. Drake sighed again. Fine. But they sense a disturbance. I think Talon will rally against us. I think so too. Let's make sure we're ready. The weak do not inherit the earth. They are crushed beneath it. It was something Rorin always taught me, and it would take nothing more than a curl of my finger to crush Talon and the Bloodspire pack to dust. The kitchen bustled with the hum of activity, pots clanging and chatter filling the air. As I stepped inside, a wave of laughter greeted me. Back again, Kyle, Arya said, her eyes crinkling with amusement. Ezra must be starving again. Indeed, I replied, tying on my black apron. Are you well? As well as can be, she chuckled, the other ladies giggling along. You know, I might just give you free rein of my kitchen if you're going to be in here every day now that Ezra's back. I won't be long, I said, feeling the heat rise to my face. Oh, it doesn't bother me, Arya teased, pinching my cheeks. Her round, warm face glowed with affection. I remember when you were just a boy, desperate to learn how to cook for your Omega. So cute and clumsy. A boy cooking food for Ezra to devour. Her smile faltered. I went to say hello to him earlier. Guess he didn't remember me much. Give it time, I murmured, gathering my ingredients. Ezra had never been good at remembering the staff. They adored him, but he rarely noticed them. It was just his way. As I threw ingredients into the pot, I made small talk with the ladies, their warmth filling the room. Once lunch was ready, I instructed Drake to fetch Ezra, then carried a steaming bowl of soup to the living room, setting it gently in his usual spot. The soft padding of footsteps made me freeze and nerves twisted in my stomach. It was always like this when I saw Ezra. The itching, the hands clammy with sweat, the throbbing mess of my heart. Most people had no idea what it was like to be a Primus Alpha. The need for my Omega was so great it consumed me. Not to mate with him, but to be around him. To have him in my space soothed me like nothing in this world ever could. With the threat of war and the enemies surrounding us, it took great effort just to stay calm and not let my emotions ravage me. Then he was here, his feet bare, the arches pale and long. His hair was the deep, warm brown of chestnuts and acorns, both the seed and the promise of what could grow. I shuddered when I looked at him. Soft shadows rippled in Ezra's blue eyes, like a serene pond tainted with oil, their usual brilliance muted under a slick sheen of suspicion. "What's this?" he asked. "Soup," I added, my tone brusque. "Eat it." "Is it poison?" He eyed it with disgust. "Yes, I brought you home just so that I could poison you," I uttered. "This isn't your home." His words were soft-spoken, and yet so delectably cruel. Ezra knew I didn't have a home. He knew that I was the runt they picked up off the streets, who did everything raw in arse just to have a seat at their table. He knew that I had nothing and nobody except this pack, except him, my mate. The words stung and I almost recoiled, but forced my face back into neutrality. "You look thin, so just eat it." I swallowed around my pain, turning to leave, but he spoke again. "I still have not seen my father." Ezra picked up the spoon and dunked it into the bowl. Instead of drinking it, though, he swirled it around and sighed. The broth was cooling, steam rising over Ezra's stony face. There were chunks of chicken, peeled carrots, celery, and a hint of sesame seed oil for flavour, along with potatoes with their skins removed because I knew Ezra didn't like them. It was all served in a carefully chosen blue china plate, patterned to match the colour of his eyes. The plate had been his mother's favourite. Did Ezra even notice? Did he see how immaculate the house was? How I'd kept everything in mint condition? His bedroom exactly as he'd left it, even down to the scent on his sheets. A strange kind of desperation fell over me, and I smoothed my hand over my face in order to distract myself from it. "You will... I won't keep him from you, now eat." "Today," Ezra demanded. "I want to see my father today." "Today? Today?" I scoffed. I had 1,000,001 things to do today, and yet the brat hadn't taken that into consideration. "Eat the food and I'll see what we can do." "Or what? Will you order me to do so? Command me as my alpha?" Ezra stood. "I'm not hungry. Take me to him, now." I took a deep breath, running my tongue along my front teeth, trying to rein in the anger as it rolled through me. Ezra hadn't eaten since yesterday. Was it so horrible that I wanted him to stop starving himself and freaking live? Even if I had to use my alpha command to do so, but I wouldn't. I learned my lesson long ago. Fine. Ezra had a stubborn tilt to his brow, and I knew I wasn't going to win this round, so I relented. I signalled to one of the servants. "Take the food back to the kitchens, and make sure it's ready to reheat. Luminous will have it later." "Yes, Altus." A servant bowed and took the dish away. "Let's go," I muttered, turning around so sharply that my cape twirled in the air. We walked through the pack, every eye following us. I was glad when Ezra grabbed a pure, white, fluffy fur coat to wear, shielding himself from the cold. Did he notice? Did he see that I bought it for him? That it had been handcrafted, handmade, just for him? My heart beat harder with each step as we reached a groove and kept walking. I could feel Ezra's confusion as I led him past the shrine and deeper into the mausoleums. His breath caught, his footsteps faltered, but I didn't stop. I just kept walking. Drake was waiting for us, holding a torch that he passed to me. "What you see must never leave this room," he warned, his voice low. "It holds all the secrets of Seraph and his future resurrection." Ezra nodded curtly and followed me inside. Using my blue light, I ignited the torches in the room. The flames erupted, lighting the space in a wild dance. I watched as Ezra's eyes widened and his mouth fell open in shock. There, in the center of the room, stood the real statue of Seraph, the one I had replaced in the shrine. The centurions were dressed in pure white robes, their hair greyed at the edges, their eyes rolled back to expose the whites as glowing runes covered their skin. They stood in a circle while Seraph floated above them, his arm outstretched. A white blanket wrapped around his waist like a snake, and above his curly hair, a crown of flames flickered and danced. "Father!" Ezra screamed, his voice a sharp, desperate cry. In the center was Rorin. Massive tentacles burst from Seraph's back, pumping into Rorin's body. He was half-shifted, blue veins throbbing through his form like grotesque twisting vines. It was sickening. Ezra's face twisted in horror as he saw it too. "What have you done to him? Dad!" Ezra screamed and darted forward, but I caught him around the waist. "Don't!" I barked, using all my alpha command to stop him. "Seraph has chosen him. Nobody must interfere." I dragged Ezra out of the tunnel, his body fighting against me. He scratched and clawed at me in desperation, but I had no choice. I pulled him away, and with Drake's help, I sealed the mausoleum doors shut. "You asshole!" Ezra screamed at me. "What the hell have you done?" "Me?" I scoffed at him. "Because I have the power to control a god." "Kale! What's it doing to him? What's happening?" Ezra demanded, and hot tears were filling his eyes. His distress flared in my nostrils, but I expected it. However, this wasn't even the worst of it. I ran a hand through my white hair, snarled under my breath, and finally, I felt the weight of the past 3 years pressing down on me. The desperation came back in full force, the aching chasm of loss and confusion hitting me, bludgeoning me over the head all at once. The world almost tilted sideways, the ground rushing up to me, but I steadied myself. This wasn't the time to show weakness, even though I desperately wanted to take Ezra in my arms, to have him hold me and eye him. To bask in his warmth, in his silence, just for one freaking minute, for one freaking second. He'd silence the noise, the shrill, never-ending screams that tore at my eardrums, relentless. The pounding restlessness of a Primus Alpha, a beast prowling the earth like a storm of destruction. It ripped apart tree trunks, shattered debris, tearing through everything in its path. Until finally, it reached the shoreline. Then it stopped. Quieted, receded, stilled. I needed Ezra to be all that for me right now. I needed it more than I needed the blood in my veins, the air in my lungs. I needed him. The realization was crippling. How had I gone 3 years without him? My shoulders slumped, and I clawed my hand across my forehead, unleashing the burden that had kept me shackled for far too long. I turned to look at him and noticed that his gaze, once clear as the summer sky, was now frost-bitten glass, cracked and fogged, harboring a chilling mistrust beneath the surface. That was fine. I could handle that. What I could not handle was him ever leaving me again. I took a breath and swallowed. I don't know. Chapter 6. Kyle. Ezra's knees buckled, his eyes were wet with terror. There were no words, none that I could use to fill the dreaded silence that had settled between us. He wanted answers, and I had none. The great Altus had fallen. To admit such failure was enough to make me want to crawl out of my skin. I lifted my hand to touch my face, to tear it off perhaps, I didn't know. Then thrust it away uselessly. Ezra's lips pursed, and I tore my gaze away from the plumpness of them, how they looked like a tiny rosebud, pink and tender. "What do you mean, you don't know?" "What else could I possibly mean?" I snapped. How long have they been like this? How long has my father—" "Since the day you left," I hit back, pacing back and forth, my cape billowing behind me, sweeping the snow off the forest floor. Ezra swallowed hard and looked away. "Since then—" He took a deep breath. "Walk me through it. What happened exactly?" No. Ezra blinked at me several times as if I'd grown 5 heads. I beg your pardon. I said no, I gritted out. This has already taken too much of my time. I have a lot to do today. You'll have to spend the rest of the day amusing yourself. Kyle, he demanded. What the hell? You can't just drop a bomb like this and walk off. Why can't I? You did, I said. It was petty, I know. Then again, I am a petty man. What difference does it make? Ezra shot to his feet, his eyes blazing blue so bright his iris looked almost white. Don't play games with me. What happened to my father? What do you think happened to him? I flung the words back at him. Your guess is as good as mine. So unless you want to start acting like the luminous of this goddamn pack, then I suggest you be quiet and wait until I have the time to answer your questions. I whirled around, intent on walking away, but Ezra grabbed my cape and yanked me back. An undignified yelp tore through my throat and I spun on him, breathing fire. Cale Vale, he seethed. You tell me what happened here, so help me. His entire face was flushed with rage, his tiny hands balled into a fist. A familiar sharp jolted through me and I felt excited at the look on his face, the way his mouth twisted in an angry frown. The force of my attraction thrilled me in the most delicious way possible, and I straightened, bringing myself to my full height. Even when we were younger, Ezra always acted like this. He had a nasty tendency to think he was the center of the universe. I saw Drake watching us from the shadows, his eyes reaching out to me in urgency. I have a lot to do today. I yanked my cape so hard out of his grasp that Ezra stumbled. If you can keep up, I'll tell you what I know. I spun again, not waiting for an answer, and stormed into the forest. The forest breathed around us, its canopy whispering secrets to the wind. Twisted roots clawed at the earth, their tendrils gnarled and ancient. Moonlight spilled through gaps in the leaves, dappling the ground like a shattered mirror. Branches swayed, as if pointing us forward, their shadows dancing in eerie rhythm. I heard the pit-patter of Ezra's feet behind me, small but certain as the snow was crushed beneath the soles of his feet. It was after the Eclipse of Howl's festival where I'd made love to you for hours, licked your skin until it was wet and dewy, and then sank into you, carving out a space for myself. I cleared my throat. After we... I kept my eyes forward. Rorin was upset, I'm sure you remember. You guys fought and... Yes, I remember, Ezra spat out. Get to the part where Seraph took him. You were hurt. Brutalized, I should say. And I was indisposed, but during that time you weren't aware that there was a disturbance at the gates. Lyric wanted to see me. He was beside himself, you see. Lyric? Ezra spat the name. You mean the flirty Omega with the big, pretty brown eyes and the mouth too big for his face? I bit back a laugh at the description. Ezra was always jealous of our friendship, even though I often assured him that the Omega meant nothing to me. Back when I lived in between the packs and before Rorin found me, Lyric had been kind to me, offering me a place to stay amidst the cold. It was nothing more than that, but Ezra believed what he wanted to believe. Oh, I'm sure he had a fun time helping you fill the holes I left behind, Ezra was saying when I didn't respond. I snorted a laugh, looking over my shoulder. Ezra's jaw was clenched, his hands curled into a fist as he all but stomped after me. I'm glad to see you didn't lose your sense of humor while you were gone. That would have been a waste. Trust me, that was the last thing I'd ever lose, Ezra said sharply. Though I'll admit, I'm intrigued to see how you and Lyric might summon the perfect little hellspawn together. Amusing, I shot back. I'll keep that in mind next time I consider how long you've been gone and how many laps you've perched on trying to fill the void I left behind. It wasn't that big of a void, Ezra snorted. In fact, I think it's just about the size of my pinky. That's not what you were saying when you were riding it for hours, swearing that it nearly split you in half. Okay, Ezra snapped. Let's get back on topic, please. I don't want to hear any more about Lyric. What happened to my father? I kept walking, biting back my smile. Lyric had always been a touchy subject for Ezra, since he was the Primus Omega of the Bloodspire pack, and beloved by Talon and most wolves alike. He had a grace that couldn't be matched. With wild ebony curls and pale milk skin, he looked like Verna, the goddess of spring reincarnated. They were apples and oranges, peaches and plumps. The only thing Lyric and Ezra had in common was they both had no gag reflex, but I wasn't going to share that story with Ezra just yet. To watch him squirm, to let him think whatever he wanted. Lyric and I were never romantic, but that didn't mean we were never physical. My mouth curled into a smile and I increased my strides. Your father was shaken while I dealt with the disturbance. I spoke, but as the memories came to me, my smile waned. It had been an ugly sight. Rorin's wails had pierced the marrow of my bone, and I had been so frightened, everyone had. I ran until my knees threatened to buckle until I reached the shrine, but Seraph wasn't there. I rolled my shoulders, trying to ease the tension collecting there. Rorin went to the shrine, but by the time I appeared he was missing and so was Seraph. What do you mean? He was gone, I said, suppressing a shudder. I had looked at that statue my entire life, its soapstone hands stretched toward the heavens, the crown of flames frozen mid-blaze, curly hair chiseled from granite as if caught in a gentle breeze. Its vacant eyes held a wistful emptiness. But now, knowing the truth, they seemed to stare with malicious intent. The stone lips, once motionless, now felt as though they had curled into a ghost of a smile, mocking us. The cracks along its face no longer seemed like mere wear, but veins, pulsating faintly, as if stone veins carried some ancient, dreadful life beneath. To think it had been alive, that it had been watching us, I whispered, the words jagged against the knot tightening in my throat. You're scaring me, Ezra whispered, his voice filled with horror. I don't know how else to say it, I replied. When we got to the mausoleum, Seraph was feeding on him. Ezra touched my shoulder, and I hadn't realized we'd reached the camp until he stopped me. The world around me fizzled out, blurring at the edges as dark spots clouded my vision. My mind replayed the scene in relentless detail. Rorin's face twisted in agony, his muzzle snapping open in a silent scream as the vein-like tentacles writhed and pulsed. They tore from Seraph's back, grotesque things, like living roots slick with ichor, pumping molten liquid into Rorin's half-shifted body. His frame convulsed violently, fur rippling as the veins beneath his skin thrashed like bloated worms trying to escape. Even now, he lay beneath the shrine stairs, gasping through his cracked muzzle, his breath bubbling with an unnatural wetness. His eyes rolled uncontrollably, whites flashing as if he were drowning. By the flames of Seraph, it was horrifying. Then the sentries came. Like zombies they walked until they were at the altar too, their hands raised as if they were seeing things that weren't there, their eyes white within their sockets. My hands trembled. I didn't what I could do, but I couldn't stomach it. I had to tell someone. I had to tell Drake. Ezra came to stand in front of me. You told Drake? He is the only one I trust, but aside from him... I peered behind Ezra, staring at all the people mulling about, some at the market stalls trading the products and others shouting at their storefronts. This was my community, my home, everything Rorin had built, and I would not see it crumple. Not as their Primus Alpha, and certainly not as their Altus. And what of the others? Talon, the Packmaster of Bloodspire Pack or Kether, the Packmaster of the Stormcrest Pack. Do any of them know? My patience with Ezra finally thinned. Tell them. Why would I confide our losses to them? And make myself look weak? Ezra breathed through his nose. No. To confide in them, maybe they know something of the ancient gods. Maybe they can... They know nothing I don't already know, I spat, stepping around him. I've consulted all the old texts, the ancient texts. There is nothing of Seraphael feeding from the Packmasters. I hissed, but forced myself to keep cool. Wolves had excellent hearing, and even though we were far away, some could still pick up on what was being said. There it is. I've told you everything that I know now, if you'll excuse me. My father, Rorin, Ezra continued as if I hadn't spoken at all. Is he in there? Is there anything left of him in there? How should I know? Do I look like a freaking psychic to you? Aren't you alphas all the same? Ezra said, his nostrils flaring. Surely you can sense something of him, Altus. I felt as if he'd struck me. A fatal blow, because Rorin and I were certainly not the same. I would never hurt Ezra. I never have. And if I did, I'd die for it. But staring deep into the cerulean pools of his eyes, I knew it was the trauma that spoke these things to me. It was the trauma that spat at me. The trauma that hurled vile words like tiny shards of glass. The trauma that stared at me with hatred filled in its eyes. Yes, the trauma. Say what you want, I'm done with this conversation. I stepped aside, but to my horror, Ezra followed close behind, refusing to give me an inch of space. It didn't matter. Once we were in the city, we could no longer speak of it, an unspoken rule among the Obsidian Clawpack. The city opened up before us, alive in its quiet strength. The buildings stood proud, their dark stone faces streaked with veins of silver that gleamed faintly in the sunlight, like ancient guardians etched with time. Their windows, polished to a shine, seemed to watch us pass, casting shifting glints that felt like winks of approval. The irrigation system I'd designed snaked through the city like a river of glass, gurgling softly as it nourished the lush gardens. Rows of vegetables swayed gently in the breeze, their vibrant greens and reds bowing like performers in a grand symphony. Fruits hung heavy from the trees, their skins glowing under the sun as if painted with molten gold. Even the market stalls seemed animated. Wooden beams creaked and groaned like old storytellers, boasting of the fresh meat and bread they offered. The scent of roasted herbs clung to the air, weaving through the cobbled streets and tugging at Ezra's senses. I could hear his sharp intake of breath behind me, though he remained silent. A giddiness swelled in my chest, my heart skipping erratically. Did he notice? Did he see the fruits of my labor? The towering structures I had shaped with my own hands? The intricate irrigation system that mirrored the great cities? We marched onward toward the center, past the beating heart of the city, and toward the massive, somber structure looming ahead. Its towering walls seemed to stretch endlessly upward, crowned with dark, jagged spires that clawed at the sky. Shadows pooled around its base, as if the building drank the surrounding light. This was the War Hall, a fortress of stone and iron as we entered. The heavy iron doors groaned on their hinges, a sound like the growl of a slumbering beast waking from its rest. Ezra's steps faltered for just a moment, but I pressed on. I strode into the room, my massive cape trailing behind me like a dark wave, parting the group of generals as if they were mere stones in a rushing river. The room itself seemed to breathe, the cold stone walls pressing in like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long as if they wished to swallow us whole. I seated myself in the packmaster's chair, the throne groaning beneath my weight, as if reluctant to bear the power it once had. Ezra's presence only added fuel to the fire. Those loyal to Rorin grumbled their discontent, their lips curling over jagged teeth, their eyes narrowing in disdain. Drake materialized by my side almost as if coming out of thin air. I lifted my hand, the room went silent. Ezra stood off to the side, his mouth pressed into a hard line as he watched on. Altus, Kren stepped forward. Thank you for meeting us today. We know how busy you've been in the last few weeks. Not too busy to meet with you, friends, I replied easily. Kren's eyes crinkled as he shared in the private joke, but then his eyes flickered to the others, Vex and Marius, who didn't look too pleased to see me on the throne. I nodded to Dean to make sure he knew I understood. So, I probed, what grievances can I settle today? Vex stepped forward as always. The massive brute had little to say that ever carried good intent, but Rorin trusted him with his life, and therefore I had to as well. Vex was built like a tank, a grizzled man with a braided red beard that nearly reached his navel. He wore the signature robes we all did, his arms and waist bound by leather straps, his black cape like a shadow trailing behind him. But it was his intense green eyes and the large axe he wielded that often made me hold my breath. Altus, he rumbled, his voice thick with authority. It seems that Luminous has returned. Why were we never informed of this development? I saw movement in my peripherals, and I saw Ezra take an excited step forward, his eyes lit at seeing Vex after so many years. Of course he was, I thought. My mouth kinked. I apologize, I said easily. So much has happened, but I plan to announce it at the Feast of Mates festival. Because, Vex continued, cutting me off. Because if the Luminous has returned unscathed, then perhaps Rorin will as well. Damn him. I gritted my teeth, glaring down at him. It was so Vex to put me in the worst freaking position imaginable. And it didn't occur to me how seeing Ezra might empower people to start thinking that I wasn't fit to rule and maybe, just maybe, the role should go to someone else. The Alpha's son. Rorin is gone, I replied blankly. As I've told you. Gone and yet, Vex said, his beady eyes drilling into mine. His son stands before us now. Why would a packmaster such as Rorin leave someone like Ezra, his only son and heir? It just doesn't add up now, does it? I stared back at him. What are you saying, Vex? Get to the root of it. Vex's smile grew. I suspect... He is right, Ezra said, coming to stand at my side. Everyone watched as he descended the long staircase and took his place at my right hand. My heart hammered as we locked eyes, and it took everything not to grab him and pull him into my arms. Ezra stood, his head held high, exuding a confidence I hadn't seen in a long time. My father is indisposed. I support Kale, 100%. I ask that you all do the same. Vex's caterpillar brows climbed his forehead. Luminous, are you certain? As I'll ever be, Ezra said, his voice so deceptively soft. We will have words later, Vex. I have missed you, dearly. Vex straightened and gave him a curt nod. What sweet, succulent lies, I thought, watching their interaction. I eyed Ezra and noted the soft smile on his lips, the way he gazed at them all with not even a fraction of the kindness he had ever given to me. What did they know about their precious Luminous? Did they know he did not eat? That even now, as the hours passed, that he hadn't eaten a thing? That I was beside myself with guilt and worry, and all I wanted to do was scream. Jealousy sprang to life within me. I set my jaw, staring straight ahead. Excellent, I plastered on a fake smile. Now that that's settled, does that mean the great Luminous will be joining us in the Feast of Mates? Ezra's smile twitched. Oh! I'm sure you don't need me there. Nonsense, I spoke, looking up at him. I think it would encourage the soldiers to see their Luminous rooting for them, don't you think? Ezra's smile froze. I think... You better stop talking or else I'll stick my foot up your ass. He muttered through clenched teeth. We both know. I'm not the one who likes things up my arse, I muttered back tersely. Come on, you aren't going to disappoint them. The hunt is on. I raised my voice to the crowd, who was now beaming with excitement. Come on, Ezra. It's been ages since we've seen you at the Feast of Mates, a voice called. Yeah, someone boomed. We'd love to run with you under the moon. That settles it, I rose, but Ezra grabbed my bicep with a frantic look in his eyes, but I shook him off. Now, if you'll excuse me, I said with all the fake cheeriness I could muster. We've got some planning to do. Kale, Ezra whispered, but I ignored him, my smile widening as I walked away. The Feast of Mates. I chuckled softly as I left the hall. It was easier than killing two birds with one stone. Ezra would have no choice but to participate, and when he did, I'd pounce on him. Saliva pooled in my mouth at the thought of the mount, the feast as they called it. Wolves writhing beneath the full moon, sleek with sweat, and the thought of Ezra beneath me made my body throb. Well, I'd like to see Ezra talk himself out of going to that.
Chapter 7. Ezra. I tracked the curl of Kale's lips, the malignant pleasure skittering over his expression. The sheer audacity of it all was rooting me to the spot. The Feast of Mates? The memories unfolded as the pages of a beloved childhood storybook, however, with each page turning, I grew more and more frightened of the throbbing in my entire body. The feast of mates. I stared at Kale's wide back, the shoulders broad and endless, almost as if they could carry the weight of the entire pack without breaking a sweat. My gaze dipped to his narrow, cinched waist. So small, so perfect. The tattoos bulged on his arms, and there was strange fey writing that Kale confessed to me one night while he was stroking my hair. He had no idea what it meant, yet it fascinated us both. My gaze went lower to his legs, long and endless, eating up the space between him and the wide dual doors. His hair swayed behind him, each strand gleaming faintly, an unsettling white, like thread of bone meticulously drawn from the marrow, delicate yet haunting. The Primus Alpha was a fine specimen indeed, and yet I could not participate in such a venture. I would not. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream at Kale and tell him to call the whole thing off, but he was already halfway out of the hall, leaving me standing on the throne with all eyes fixated on me. Crap. I smiled nervously, twisting the fabric of my robes in my hand. Vex was the first to break the silence. His eyes were like saucers as he stepped toward the throne. Luminous, is that really you? Are you back? I was running before I even registered it, sprinting down the flight of stairs and flinging myself in Vex's wide, muscular arms. He caught me with a startled laugh, twirling me around, his flaming red hair brilliant in the torchlights. Stars above and me. Vex laughed. You're really back. Oh, we've missed you so much. I laughed harder, peppering his face with kisses, until finally someone behind us cleared their throat. Crap. Vex let me down, and we separated quickly, and I realized I had forgotten decorum for a moment. Sorry, I said to the rest of the men. Luminous. Kren spoke, his smile thin. It brings me great joy to see you returned so ripe with happiness. However, you must know what's been going on in your absence. Please allow me to take you to my chambers where we can discuss this. I already know, I said, cutting Kren off. Kyle has shared most of it, and rest assured, I trust Kale as did my father, your packmaster. We are in good hands. Kren's mouth thinned. Luminous has been gone for so long, I must ask, why now did you return? And why did you leave in the first place? Enough. Vex waved him off. Let him rest for a moment. All will be revealed, I'm sure of it. What news of the Packmaster? I yearn to speak to my dear friend again. There is so much to share. Why does he not return as well? Since you left, he's been beside himself with grief. You must know that, Luminous. Grief? Ha! My father grieved. It was by far the funniest thing I had ever freaking heard. However, I knew the many faces of the Packmaster and was careful not to expose them. Behind closed doors, my father hated me. He hated that I wasn't as strong as Lyric, hated that I wasn't interested in anything to do with the Pack, and most of all, he hated the rumors going around that I wasn't actually his son. My father is well, sort of, and in good health. I took a deep breath. Kren is right. There is much to catch up on. Please allow me a few days to familiarize myself again with my surroundings, and then I will contact you. Kren was about to protest, but Vex stepped in front of me, shielding me. Of course, Luminous. We are at your service. I smiled fondly at the big oaf and touched his arm, infusing his wolf with some of my warmth. Vex's veins rose for a moment, pulsating blue before his mouth curved into a dopey smile. Thank you, Luminous. You are most generous. I touched them all one by one, familiarizing myself once again with their wolves like I had done to Kale on the first day. It was different, to say the least. Most of them were eager and excited, but I found it all a bit lackluster, and I couldn't put my finger on what it was exactly. It might have been what I saw today. The horror of it still gripped me, and I retreated back to the mansion on the hill, in desperate need of solace. When I arrived, the mansion loomed against the twilight, its gabled roof slicing the sky like a jagged blade. I quickly made my way to the library, where rows of books seemed to breathe in the stillness, their spines arching under the weight of untold stories of our past that I knew Roran kept under lock and key. Even though my father had been packmaster for many years, he rarely shared the Obsidian Claw Pack's most sacred secrets. I quickly found the book I sought, Eclipsed by Moonlight, Chronicles of the Wolf Gods. Its leather cover bore the scars of centuries, its spine cracked yet unyielding. Flipping through the fragile pages, I read about Seraphael, our patron, the flame-crowned protector. The Stromcrest pack revered Thalvir, the Stormbringer, whose howls summoned thunder and rain. Meanwhile, the Bloodspire pack worshipped Kerthos, the Bloodforged, a god whose fangs were said to have carved the first wolves from the marrow of the fallen. I knew from many of the wolves that it was said that each Primus Omega was birthed from one of the gods. Even my own mother said she laid with Seraphael and gave birth to me right at the foot of his shrine. I didn't know how true that was, but growing up I had never felt particularly close to Roran. Still, that didn't explain what was happening now. Why was my father like that? Why had Seraph chosen him? Of all the wolves here? It just didn't make any sense. I thought back to Roran's face, half-shifted, caving in on itself as Seraph's tentacles pumped his body with its essence. It was enough to make my stomach roll, and the sentries standing there, their eyes white and rolled back into the sockets. It was almost demonic, like a demonic possession. I had never heard of such horrors. But here I was witnessing it, witnessing my father become a husk. A shiver crawled down my spine and I almost put the book back, but froze when I saw there were several pages missing. No, not missing, they were torn out. I balked, flipping frantically through the pages that spoke about Seraph's possession and why he chose the people he did. Who would have done this? And why? Kyle, maybe? I gritted my teeth. Of course it was Kale. It had to be. Why would he bring me to the shrine and only share half the information he knew? It was a freaking ploy. All of it must be to get me to yield to him. It was clear he wanted nothing more than to be the packmaster, but without me or Roran backing him up, then the pack wouldn't allow it. I was the Alpha's son. Roran was the packmaster, but with Roran out of the way and me returning as Kale's mate, nothing was standing in his way. I needed to figure out what he was hiding. I needed to know how he'd gotten Seraph to choose Roran so that he could rule the Obsidian Claw Pack. Then again, how would Kale have control over a god? Damn it, this was getting confusing. I wanted to be in and out, but now with the pack at stake, the Luminal Order would have to wait. I couldn't see Gideon now, and I knew sooner or later he'd become impatient. There wasn't much time to figure everything out. A swift knock on the door startled me, and I jumped, fumbling with the book for a second before shoving it back in its place. Drake stuck his head through the door, peering into the door room before his gaze landed on me. "Luminous?" "I'm here," I said, my heart racing. I stepped closer to the door and smoothed out the wrinkles in my clothes. "Did you need something?" "Altus is in the drawing room. He'd like to speak to you about the—" Drake flushed. "Feast of Mates, before the preparations begin." Preparations. I scoffed, then shoved my way past Drake and into the drawing room where Kale was seated, his legs crossed, his back straight, and his expression almost regal. This used to be my mother's favorite room, the claw-footed chairs poised as though ready to move, their velvet cushions inviting to the touch. The walnut armoire loomed with carved floral motifs unfurling like frozen vines. My mother had adored this room, its symmetry and elegance, but to me it felt suffocating, heavy with a past I couldn't escape. Kale sat on the purple velvet couch, its deep fabric seeming to absorb the light, drawing shadows into its plush folds. He held a delicate china cup, its swirling blue designs a perfect match for my own eyes. It seemed too small for hands that large. I watched in mild fascination as he sipped the tea, his firm lips pressing against the pure white china, almost the same color as his skin. Kale's mouth wasn't that of a wolf's. It was thin and lined, but all the more alluring for it. His nose was long and pointed like an arrow, while his feline eyes glowed a vibrant yellow. I watched as his tongue darted out to catch a stray drop, pulling it into his mouth as if it were sweet nectar. My face grew hot, and I quickly tore my eyes away. "What do you want?" Kyle's smile grew. "As Drake would have told you, I'm here to discuss—" The Feast of Mates, I concluded. Well, tough I'm not going. Kyle's brows climbed his forehead. You said you would. I know. In front of all your father's generals. I know, I gritted out, ignoring the smugness in his voice. But as you can see, it's impossible for me to go. Oh. Kyle crossed his legs and uncrossed them, his hands steepled. Why is that? You know why, I hissed at him. I cannot possibly, not after... Not after what? He rose, then started advancing toward me, his eyes almost feral. I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated by him. I don't want to play games, Kyle. You forced me into it back there, and now you'll have to explain why I won't be joining them. I'll have to explain. Have you gone mute? He laughed. No, I'm not explaining anything. Tell the pack yourself why you abandoned them and why you won't even spend one freaking festival with them. It's not with them. It's with you, I replied coldly. I abandoned you, and I cannot spend one freaking festival with you. Anger took hold of his expression. Kyle stared down at me, his hair spilling over his shoulder like a waterfall of white. I see. More excuses from the pampered princess. They are not excuses, I said calmly. I don't want to risk... It's just not possible. Kyle snorted. Once again, I see. He circled me. More lies, it seems, from that vicious tongue of yours. My nostrils flared. Lies? Yes, lies, Cale replied, giving me a cool once-over. You want it? No. Yes, you do. You want me. But it's the same crap it always was, except now you have the chance and still you won't take it. How very typical. I see now. I see it all, actually. He scoffed, his mocking laughter hitting me. I felt as if I were boiling from within. He inflamed me. Of course, I wanted him. Kyle was my mate in every sense of the word. Every feast of mates we rutted like beasts in the field, raw and desperate, his great knot expanding to the point of pain, to the point of trying to split me open. There had been no other alpha's knot I had taken, not in the 3 years I'd been gone. I ached for him, and yet, when I looked at him, I felt hatred consume me. You can't see! I spat at him. You'll never see. That due to your inaction, you've murdered the thing you loved so much about me, and in its place sprouted a black pit. Kyle's face went white with anguish, but he barreled through. This isn't about you. This is about the pack, and the fact that they've been without the Luminous for 3 freaking years. Nothing more needs to happen, Ezra. Just show up, shift, and then you can be on your merry way. I laughed as if it were that simple. The pull of the moon was like the force of gravity. Sooner or later we'd succumb to it, but Cale was right. This wasn't about me or him, it was about the pack. I set my jaw. Fine. Good, Kyle replied, and took a deep breath. The feast will be prepared in honor of Seraph as always. The mates will line up once the full moon is at its peak and begin the hunt. You will be front as center as always. I will pursue you. Like before. I swallowed hard, willing those memories to remain at bay. Fine, I repeated. After we'll offer prayers to Seraph for fertility, Cale said. And that's it. Images of us lying on the field of grass were thrust into my head, and then Cale gave chase, his powerful body ripping up chunks of trees and debris as I raced frantically through the forest. Then he'd catch me, smother me with his body, and press me down into the earth until his shaft sank home. I wet my dry lips, feeling suddenly too hot all over. Whatever, get out! Gladly, Kyle left, his cape billowing behind him, leaving me standing there with saliva pooling in my mouth and a throbbing ache building between my legs. This was going to be a freaking disaster. What the hell was I thinking agreeing to this? There were so many things going on. I needed to speak to Gideon. I couldn't do that if I was planning a festival. And what if things got out of hand? What if Cale actually mounted me? Oh gods, why was I even considering it? I touched my mating glands, finding the area pulsating with heat. It had been 3 years since I felt anything remotely titillating. 3 years since I felt any more than despair. Now, one conversation and one memory, and I was willing to throw myself at Kale's feet. No, not after what he'd done. What he'd let Roran do to me. I ran a hand through my curly hair, noticing how the strands were getting longer. I paused, staring at my hands. My nails were longer too, almost like talons. What the hell? I walked to the side mirror and stared at my reflection. My eyes were two bright, swirling pools of blue. My lips were pink and wet, but it was throbbing. The freaking ache. The heat. The longing. To my horror, I realized it was lust. I was lusting after my mate, after Kale. I desperately wanted his thick knot to stuff me to the brim. What was happening to me? I thought, my breath coming in quick, rapid hiccups. My chest tightened as if the ghost of fingers pinched them into raised nubs. My hole clenched over warm air, and gods, for the first time in 3 years, I was going into a freaking heat. Right before the Feast of Mates. Kale had been right. The hunt was on. Chapter 8. Ezra. I was completely screwed. Closing my eyes, I took a deep, calming breath, trying to hold still as the night began sliding down around me. Through the wide bay windows, the cloudy night parted just enough to reveal a sliver of the starlit sky, as if splitting open to make way for the emerging moon. The servants draped the fabric of silks around my narrow waist. The fabric was smooth and cool against my skin. It was done every year during the Feast of Mates. I was supposed to be Seraph, while Kale was supposed to be the mad god of the underworld Virkosan. As the story goes, Seraph was walking naked beneath the full moon, his flaming golden crown upon his footsteps lighting up the earth with each step. Virkosan had seen him and pounced. The rest, as they say, is history. They were mates until the end of the time. Well, until Virkosan betrayed Seraph by stabbing him in the back and stealing his pack. Then, in his grief, Seraph turned to stone, standing in the very place Virkosan had taken him when they first rutted together in the fields, or so the legends say. It was a sad tale, but I chose not to dwell on it. I flinched when I felt a servant put the metal ring in my chest, then moved on to the other one, threading a golden chain through my navel and wrapping it securely around my waist. "Here," a voice said, passing me some golden bangles to wear. "Thank you." The words died in my throat when I saw it was Celine. Her raven hair was pinned back loosely, framing a face too regal for the plain servant's dress she wore, simple gray linen cinched at the waist with a frayed sash. "What the—" She grinned up at me and stepped away quickly. I forced myself to remain calm, but my heart was beating fast. Nobody else seemed to notice, and once I was finished, I waved them all away, except for her. Once the last of the servants left, I rounded on her. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Hello to you too, Ezra," Selena smirked. "Looking good, I might add. I love the nipple rings." "I thought Gideon said you were soldiers." "Just him and Maeve," she replied. "It's easier for me to pretend to be a servant. So, the Feast of Mates? Sounds hot." "It's not," I said. "It's more like a punishment." "For what?" "For not keeping my big fat mouth shut," I sighed. "Anyway, what did you find out?" "When can I get out of here?" Celine cocked her head. "Do you want to get out of here? You don't look like you want to get out of here." "Don't let the get-up fool you," I said. God, I didn't even know what the hell I was trying to say. Nothing was making sense to me. Selena leaned against the mahogany desk, her expression open. "Never mind. What did you find out?" "Not much," Selena responded. "I went rifling through your father's books, but I couldn't find anything on Exilium. Gideon hasn't had much luck either, so we're hoping you can wring some information out of Kale tonight." "He won't tell me anyway," I said. Celine arched a brow at me. "Have you asked?" "No, but I didn't want to tell her that. There were things about the Obsidian Claw Pack that needed to be kept secret. Even though I planned to betray Kyle, I wanted the pack to remain safe. The Luminal Order was meant to ensure the laws, but I was a total fool. I knew they were also looking to gain the Obsidian Claw Pack's secrets and discover how we became the strongest pack in the lands." He doesn't trust me yet. Celine shrugged. Well, what better way to gain his trust than to screw him? My mom used to say, the faster way to a man's heart is through his stomach. But if that doesn't work, there's always straight-up banging. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, I huffed. Anyway, Kyle isn't like that. The screwing, I mean. He never consider it like that. What do you mean? Celine asked. When we were mates, he used to... I took a deep breath. He considers making love an art. It always lasted a minimum of 4 hours or else he wouldn't want to do it. No kidding, Celine laughed. Damn, she whistled. So it's like that. I felt my face becoming warm from the memories. We grew up together. I knew Kale better than I liked to admit, but even now, with the way my body was feverish with heat, I knew he would carve out time for us to be together. I just wasn't sure if I was ready for it. So much had happened in the past. I stepped off the platform, and the move jolted my entire body, including the rings driven through my chest, and I gasped. Celine caught my elbow, guiding me to the chair while I breathed in heavily through my nose, trying to quell the shivers racking my entire body. You're halfway gone already, Celine exclaimed. He must be hung like a horse. Celine, I gritted out. Please. Celine bit back a smile and fussed over my hair. Her touch was deft but unassuming, her eyes darting to the door just as a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Drake stuck his head in, his sharp gaze immediately landing on Celine. She grabbed the discarded clothes from the floor and hurried out without a word. Drake's eyes followed her, narrowing in suspicion as the door clicked shut behind her. Who's that? I don't recognize her. She's new, I lied, smoothing the folds of my ceremonial robes with deliberate calm. Shall we? Drake's frown deepened, but he said nothing, gesturing toward the door. Stepping outside, the scene before me was both awe-inspiring and oppressive. The golden chair palanquin gleamed under the torchlight, borne by servants dressed in plain, identical robes, their faces expressionless as they shouldered the weight. They stood rigidly, holding the chair's arms like pillars supporting a shrine. I sighed, the sound swallowed by the hum of waiting attendants and murmured prayers. Climbing into the palanquin, I settled uneasily into its cushioned seat. The cool night air brushed against my fevered skin, momentarily soothing the sweat gathering at my brow. As the procession began, I closed my eyes briefly, willing myself to endure what came next. The gates were sealed tight, soldiers standing firm as they held back the surging crowd. People waved candles and neon blue glow sticks in the air, the flickering lights making strange shadows. Children ran through the chaos, pretending to be Seraph and Virkasan, chasing each other with their glowing sticks. I forced a smile, trying to look calm for them, but something about the crowd wasn't right. Their cheers were too loud, growing sharper, almost like screams. The way they pushed against the guards, their faces twisted with wild, forced smiles, sent a shiver down my spine. It felt wrong, like the joy was a mask hiding something darker. When we reached the great hall, Kale was already there, waiting near the throne. He was dressed in a pale gray robe, his long white hair spilling down his back. His bare chest was covered in intricate fey tattoos, curling and twisting like living vines. He stood tall, imposing and unmoving. The servants set the chair down, and I stepped toward the stage, my legs shaky beneath me. My head spun, my body so light I felt like I was floating. Sweat clung to my skin, dampening my hair, and my chest throbbed with every step. Before I could steady myself, Kyle grabbed me. His strong arms pulled me close, his hot breath brushing my face. What's happening to me? I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know, Kyle said, his grip tightening. It was almost painful. It must be... Seraph. Seraph? I'd never seen the god cause anything like this. The high priest cleared his throat from the side. He wore a golden crown with sharp spikes, black eyeshadow painted in harsh strokes around his eyes, and black lipstick that glistened under the torchlight. He looked like one of the Seraphael saints come to life, his gaze piercing, waiting. In the light of Seraph's eternal flame, we cast off our mortal bonds and embrace the divine. I couldn't focus on anything. The only thing I could see was Kale. He smelled of frost-kissed pines and the smoky undertone of burning wood, an intoxicating blend that reminded me of a wild moonlit night. It was impossible to resist, much like the golden intensity of his eyes. I touched his face, tracing the lines of his long nose and his thin, pinched mouth that I would have kissed until the end of time. "Take me. Mount me." He hooked his arm around my waist and dragged me closer until my entire body was pressed up against him, my pierced chest rubbing against his skin. God, I was a wreck. What the hell was going on? I groaned, wrapping my arms around Kyle's wide shoulders, nuzzled against his corded neck. I tracked with greedy eyes the veins within his skin throb. His hands were like claws, the massive nails digging into my skin as if he too were fighting the shift. The room tilted, shadows blurring at the edges of my vision as my pulse raced wildly, thundering in my chest. My skin burned, drenched in sweat, every fiber of my being aching with an insatiable need for Kyle, a hunger that left me trembling and hollow. Take me. Mount me. But this wasn't my voice. These weren't my words. Hail Seraph, whose breath ignites the stars and whose will shapes our fates. Seraphiel's saint droned on. Then something strange happened. All at once, the crowd swelled like a storm at sea, bodies colliding and sloshing together in a chaotic frenzy. The air was thick with their wild cries, the energy of rabid wolves feeding off each other's madness, their aggression building with every passing moment. "Get on with it! Can't you see they'll tear this place to the ground?" Kale snarled. The saint flinched, fumbling with the passage. He stuttered, then found his way again. By the blood of the covenant and the glow of the sacred flame, we stand united under his gaze. Go now, go and bask within the light. I release you all." Kale tore out of there with me securely tucked within his arms. His body moved like a blur, half shifting, his face caving in on itself, turning monstrous. The wave of people followed, chasing after him like mindless zombies. Skin cracked and tore, and ripping sounds filled the air as they shifted into massive beasts. The bright moon was almost blinding, and I was delirious, sweat making my body drenched. Then I shoved Kale out of the way and exploded into a massive wolf. 3 years. I'd been holding it in for 3 years, and all at once it all came out. I ripped up chunks of earth, tearing through the trees with Kale hot on my heels. His white wolf was massive, razor-sharp ice antlers adorning his head, twisted like metal, and his yellow eyes burned like fire. I ran and ran and ran and kept running. I kept running until my lungs burned, until the air grew hot and wet, and until my knees threatened to buckle. I could not let him catch me. I felt delirium creeping in, dizzy as the trees were torn from their trunks, the earth shaking under my paws as Kale leaped after me, faster than I could imagine. Fear gripped my heart, wild and primal, the horror mixing with the sublime. Kale darted left, disappearing into the dense foliage while I raced on, the moon above like a cold eye watching. I barked a laugh in my wolf form, finally feeling free, the sound echoing in the night. Just as I was about to leap into a stream, a massive claw yanked me back, ripping me through the underbrush. My heart shot into my throat as Kale loomed over me, his massive white wolf form like a nightmare. His great horns twisted like jagged, broken iron, a grotesque crown of terror, and his yellow eyes blazed with a fire that pierced through the night, looking into the depths of my soul. I shifted back, trembling, staring up at him. Slick was oozing from me now in small rivulets down my thighs like a fresh spring. "Come, drink," I whispered to him in my thoughts, and as if he heard, Kale shifted back. I saw his flesh twisting and warping as his bones cracked with the sound of overcooked meat. His body peeled away like the skin of an orange, the wolf dissolving into the mess of human flesh. Kyle crawled over me, his yellow eyes piercing as he stared down at me. I exhaled shakily. "Kyle." He cupped my face, his expression cracked open and bare for the first time. "Don't leave me again, Ezra. Please promise me." I was breathing harder and harder, wishing he'd hurry up and get on with it. "Take me, mount me." I promise nothing." Rage flashed in his eyes, and he pinned my arms above my head. "Have it your way," he said bitterly, then sank his teeth into my neck, into my mating glands. I cried out, arching into him. I felt the spill of my blood as it filled his mouth, his sharp teeth piercing my skin like a glacial crust. He drank the holy blood, sucking in long and deep pulls with enough force to yank the earth from right under me. When the bond clicked into place, it felt like our souls were stitched together with barbed wire. The pain was excruciating, like my skin was being shredded from the inside out, each thread of our connection burning into my flesh. His thoughts became mine. His hunger, his rage, his bloodlust. It was all part of me now, a constant gnawing hunger that clawed at my sanity. I saw his wolf, huddled in the corner once again, cowering from me. No! I reached for it, hands outstretched, but Kale forced me back and tore his mouth away. I groaned, squirming beneath him, wanting to go back, but unable to. The visions melted away like wax, and Kale's face blurred into view once again. "Kale, my everything," I whimpered. "Shut up." Kale snapped. He grabbed my chin, his gaze fierce. "If I'm your everything, why did you leave?" "You lying. Screw it." He smashed our lips together hard, his teeth grazing mine as his hands gripped the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The kiss was frantic, desperate, as if he couldn't get close enough, couldn't consume enough of me. My heart raced, and I was drowning in him, in the heat. The words dissolved on my tongue, and he crushed me to his chest. I melted into the touch, our bodies relaxing into one another like thawing ice. "Take me, mount me." And Kale did. After it was done, I felt wrung dry of all feeling, as if the moon itself had drained me of everything. Time opened up to us, the world splitting in a moon-drenched haze, Kyle's body surrounding me, and I saw everything. The pack, their perspective, their wants and dreams, the soldier, the farmer. My body felt like liquid as I moved from one to the other. Then I was flying. A bird's-eye view, and it struck me once again that these weren't my own thoughts. They were Seraph's thoughts. But how? How could this be? Then I was back in the mausoleum, my father slumped on the stage in his massive wolf form, pumped with Seraph's tentacles as they dug deep into his back. Then his eyes were opening. I recoiled as if I'd been slapped, landing back into my body, my eyes wide with terror. "Shh," Kale said frantically. "What's wrong? What's wrong? Stop screaming." I didn't know I had been screaming, but it seemed I hadn't even heard myself. It's Roarin'," I gasped. "He's awake."
Chapter 9. Kyle. "Sir, we found him," Drake whispered through the link. I stirred, blinking rapidly until the haze of sunlight filling the room forced me to open my eyes. Ezra's bare body was pressed up against mine, his delicious scent a blend of deep amber and the sweetness of sugared berries wafted into my nostrils. I nuzzled against his neck, licking the bite mark there, the jagged skin that had yet to heal. Dirt and dry leaves were stuck in Ezra's curly brown hair, and his skin was covered with grass stains and soil. A smile tugged at my lips, and I reluctantly pulled away from him. Ezra made a noise in his throat, pawing at my arms as I tried to extract myself from his greedy little hands. "Bring him to my chambers," I told Drake, and then stood. I palmed my shaft, which was chafed from all the screwing we'd done the night before, and put on some clothes, strapping on my weapons and pulling my hair in a high ponytail. I threw on my cape and kissed Ezra's forehead goodbye. Then I left the room, closing the door behind me. Last night had been insane. By Seraph's burning light, I had never seen the Feast of Mates ceremony get that out of control. It was almost as if the common people were possessed. I pinched the bridge of my nose and then rubbed the sleep out of my eyes. There was still work to be done. The streets were a mess. Ruined streamers tangled in my boots as I marched out of the mansion. People staggered around, some laughing, others half-dressed, their faces flushed with wine and mischief. Soldiers worked to restore order, sweeping debris and guiding the rowdy back to their homes. I nodded to the ones I recognized, my body aching with every step, but too stubborn to slow down. The great hall loomed ahead, its stone walls solid against the chaos. Drake stood waiting by the side door. Without a word, we slipped inside, heading straight to my office. The man, Gideon, I was told, stood ramrod straight in the center of the room. A few soldiers were guarding him and saluted me the second they saw me. "Altus," Drake said. "This is him." "Thank you. Dismissed," I said to the other soldiers. But Drake remained at my side. I regarded the beta coolly while he kept his gaze straight ahead, but something in his eyes caught my attention. A flicker of something. Not awareness, but proximity. A trait only alphas exhibited when another alpha got too close to them for their liking. Betas weren't nose sensitive, most of the remaining neutral to alphas or omegas, but normal alphas were especially sensitive to Primus alphas because they presented the biggest threat. Curious. I stepped even closer, and he tensed. It was minuscule, but I could see his cheek jump and his eye twitch. I ran my nose along his collar. His scent was that of a beta, but slightly sterile. Scent blockers, perhaps? Walking over to the desk, I poured myself a drink of water and drained it, taking my time to consider my options. "You know, I've lived here my whole life," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I've seen so many people come and go. So many wolves join the Obsidian Claw Pack and leave or be killed just as quickly." Gideon nodded. "I heard that about you, like many of us in the Stormcrest Pack, that you've lived here since you were young and taken under the Packmaster's wing. I admired that about you, Altus." My mouth twitched into a smile. "Interesting," I said, leaning against the desk. "That you've heard so much about me, and yet I've heard nothing about you." "Altus!" Drake moved like lightning, kicking the back of Gideon's knees. He dropped with a grunt, his hands splaying to catch himself. Before he could recover, Drake had a knife to his throat, the blade gleaming. "Speak carefully," Drake hissed, his voice low and lethal. "Or don't speak at all." Gideon's eyes widened in fear. "Altus, I'm from the Stormcrest Pack. Yes, you've said," I replied. "But nobody there seems to know who you are." I cocked my head. "Nobody seems to know you here either, or in Dusksong or anywhere else, I might add. It seems you just appeared out of thin air. How strange." "I recently joined. I'm a rogue." "If that were true, you would have tried to tear me to shreds," I said easily. "I've seen many mindless rogues in my lifetime, and none of them seemed as civilized as you seem to be. So tell me, Gideon of the Stormcrest Pack, what are you doing here, and why are there 3 other wolves joining you?" "Celine. And Maeve. I think the other one is called." "I don't know them," Gideon replied. "I have no idea who they are. And yet, all 3 of you joined simultaneously, one right after the next," I said. "I know every wolf here, every face as I have for the last 20 years. We ever or rarely accept new wolves, which begs the question, how did you get in? How did you join the ranks?" "I told you we came from the Stormcrest Pack." I didn't let him finish. My fist collided with his jaw, the crack echoing through the room as his head snapped back. Gideon groaned, spitting blood onto the floor, but I loomed over him, my chest heaving. "Don't freaking lie to me," I growled, my voice cold as steel. "You were following my mate, stalking him. I want to know the truth." "Please. I've told you everything that I know," Gideon wheezed, and Drake pressed the blade of the knife deeper against his Adam's apple. "I saw your mate, and I thought he looked familiar. Nothing more." More lies. In the photos, he'd stayed several paces behind Ezra while he trekked up the mountain, then again in the gardens. Drake recognized him immediately. He was following Ezra. That meant he was dangerous. I wanted to crush him. Something in my gut was screaming at me to kill this man and the others he brought with him. If he was a spy, Rorin would not spare him or anyone else who attempted to learn the Pack's secrets. I stood, smoothing out my clothes. The scent of fear is the only true currency. It buys everything, I said slowly. "Take him to the pit." Drake's eyes widened fractionally, but he hauled Gideon to his feet and took him away screaming. When he came back, he was frowning, and I took another drink of water, trying to calm down. "Speak," I said to Drake. The pit. Are you sure? He may be a spy at worst, but isn't that a bit too harsh? Harsh? I snorted. This man infiltrated our base. I don't know who he works for or what his plan is. He's put everyone at risk. I looked at Drake. Do you know what's at stake if this gets out? If anything we've done gets out. I took a deep breath. No, the pit is the best place for him. The people he's working for will make a move once they hear of it, and only then will we know the extent of who he works for. So, it's a trap? Drake asked. Of sorts, I replied. Lure the flies with honey, not crap. Drake bit back a smile. Yes, Altus. I shall retire now, I said to him. See to it that the news has spread. Drake saluted, and I turned on my heel, stepping out into the streets of the Obsidian Clawpack just as the sun crested the horizon. The golden light spilled across the cobblestones, illuminating the mess of last night. People were busy cleaning up, their movements slow and tired, some clearly worn and hungover. Despite their exhaustion, they waved to me as I passed, offering small smiles. I smiled back, a warmth spreading through my chest. This was my pack, my family, and I would do everything in my power to protect them. When I returned to the mansion, the sound of running water told me Ezra was in the shower. My limbs were heavy and ached something fierce. Stripping off my clothes, I slid into bed, sinking into the cool sheets with a sigh. My body ached, and my eyelids grew heavy. 3 more hours of sleep. That was all I needed before facing the day again. I closed my eyes and seconds later felt the bed dip beside me. Ezra kissed my neck, his body warm and solid as he lay next to me, hooking his thigh over mine. I hummed and wrapped my arms around him and his delicious warmth. Ezra brushed his nose over my cheek, scenting me as he settled back onto his pillow. You weren't here when I woke, and I could almost hear the pout. Sorry, I was needed elsewhere. There was a situation with one of the soldiers, I replied, lazily running my hands up and down his spine, stopping at the curve of his plump arse before running my hand over it. By Seraph's burning light, he was warm and firm, his arse like 2 plums touched by the sunlight. Kale, he whispered, pressing back into my fingers. I hummed, my eyes still closed. Even though I was dead tired, my shaft wasn't, and it was violently twitching against my stomach. Ezra was squirming against me, getting impatient, and I knew he'd want me to mount him soon. Sorry, love. I'm dead on my feet. You'll have to do all the work this time. Fine by me, Ezra said, straddling my hips. And together, we reached for the stars.
Chapter 10. Ezra. All I dream of are new beginnings, I thought, touching the naked branches covered by frost. Snow danced around me, and I smiled into it as I felt the flakes crest upon my cheeks. I had awoken to a dreamland, and decided to walk through the gardens wearing nothing but my cloak and Kale's scent clinging to my skin. The sky was filled with rolling clouds of gray, but the evergreens and the snowy mountain peaks made me realize how much I missed this place, how much I loved it. Kale had been a gangly teen, a teenager with limbs too long for his body, always tripping over his own feet. But in the snow, he seemed to find his balance. He'd chase me around the yard, his laughter ringing out like a bell, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. My mother would watch us with a soft smile, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold in her joy. Those were simpler days, filled with the crunch of boots in the snow and the fleeting magic of winter afternoons. I crouched in the snow and picked it up, watching it melt from the heat of my skin, feeling almost dazed. There was a slight throbbing in my backside. It hurt to move, but it all felt delicious. Last night had been wonderful, and it was the first time in such a long time that I felt truly connected to the Obsidian Clawpack. I thought of the people trampling each other to get to us. I thought of Kale shooting out of the hall like a bullet and then taking me deep into the forest. Everything else was a fevered dream. Us rutting in the earth, the heat of his skin, the taste of his breath. What had happened that night? The Feast of Mates happens every year, but nothing like this. The people sloshing at the base of the stage, rolling up and up as if they were a great wave about to consume us. Their eyes burned with a feverish intensity, pupils dilated as though they stared into another realm. They moved in jerky, unpredictable motions, arms flailing as guttural chants spilled from their lips, unintelligible yet hypnotic, pulling others into their fervor. I couldn't make sense of any of it. I wanted to talk to Cale about it, but knew it was better if he rested. Last night had taken a toll on me as well, but I had time to recuperate while he did not. I spent more time in the fields of snow, reacquainting myself with the land, my home. Their heavy pounding of feet made me still, and I stood up, turning around to see Celine breathless as she rounded the corner. "Ezra! Ezra! He's—" Celine's entire body seized, an electronic shock jolted through her. Several soldiers rounded the corner, dressed in the obsidian claw pack, their stun guns pointing at her. "Target secured." "What are you doing?" I demanded and raced toward her. I knelt but didn't touch her, noticing how her body jerked and spasmed with each volt. "Stop it," I said. "Leave her alone." "This person is a suspected spy and traitor." Drake's voice bled from the shadows. "It is Altus will we take her." I stared at Drake incredulously. A suspected spy? Did Cale know already? My heart was skipping by the time they pulled Celine to her feet. Her wide, tear-streaked eyes locked onto mine, pleading for help. The soldiers in their sleek black uniforms hauled her up like she was nothing more than a broken doll. "Altus commands?" I spat the words. "You're hiding behind his orders because it suits you. What proof do you even have? She's loyal." Drake's lips twitched into a humorless smirk. "Her loyalty is not for you to decide." He glanced at the soldiers. "Move her to the transport. Quickly, Luminous." He gave a mock salute and then hauled her away. I stood there shell-shocked for several moments, my chest rising and falling rapidly. A traitor? How did Cale figure it out so quickly? What did he know? If I rushed in there blindly, would he suspect me too? None of this was making sense. I couldn't act recklessly. I needed to figure out how Cale got his information. Gods, why did I start trusting him again? It was stupid to participate in the Feast of Mates. I had a job to do, which was to bring down Cale and Roran for distributing exilium to the wolves. 1 or 2 nights of passion wasn't going to change that. What the hell had I been doing anyway? Sitting outside in the freaking snow, daydreaming, while Cale was waging war against the community. I ran a hand through my hair and stormed back into the house. I wrenched open the bedroom door, but Cale was still deep in sleep, my mouth curled into a frown, and I thought about waking him up, but found that I couldn't. He looked so peaceful. Damn it. I went back downstairs, closing the door firmly behind me. Gritting my teeth, I went to get something to eat, intending to wait until Cale woke up. It was dusk before I felt the bond between us stir, rippling to life as Kyle awoke. I stood from my seat in the dining room, dressed now in obsidian claw-pack clothing befitting my rank. I climbed the stairs with a measure of calmness and opened the door just as Kyle was sitting up. His white-silver hair fell down his shoulders like silk as he rubbed his eyes. By the flames of Seraph. How long was I asleep? 9 hours, I replied. You must have been tired. Cale's mouth tugged into a smile, and he yawned, stretching his massive arms over his head. Well, I had quite the workout yesterday. He smiled, tilting his head regarding me. Why are you over there? Come here. I bristled and stayed with my feet firmly planted to the floor. Roran has awakened. I'd like to see him. Kyle looked puzzled for a moment, and the recognition showed in his eyes. Ah, yes. Roran. Sure. Just let me... He searched around for his clothes, and I grabbed them from the chair. They were neatly folded and pressed, ready for him to wear. When I moved to give it to him, he grabbed my wrist and yanked me into his arms. A cry fell from my lips as I stumbled into him, and Kyle locked his arms around me, holding me close. Now that's much better, he whispered, then kissed me softly on the lips. I huffed, my heart beating fast, and I felt myself yield to him. Kyle, we really should... I groaned when his tongue teased my upper lip and pried my mouth open. He tasted like salt in the earth, like soil in the sea. Our chests rose and fell together while we kissed, his hands fisting my hair. Kyle pulled back breathlessly. I meant to ask last night, but... He stroked my cheek. Did you take precautions? I frowned, slightly dazed. What? Kyle snorted a laugh. I mounted you during your heat. Have you taken precautions? Oh. I scrambled out of his arms. Crap. I didn't think so. No, but I'll call the doctor immediately and... Wait, I said hurriedly. I need to see Roran, and then after we can... I felt my face grow hot. It wasn't the first time we had a pregnancy scare, and it wouldn't be the last, but I would endeavor to be more careful going forward. I remembered the conversations I used to have with Roran about it, and how much anxiety would spike within me at the thought. Roran made it clear my only function in the pack was for breeding, and when I failed to do so during our first few months of mating, he became angry, calling me worthless and stupid. Kale licked his lips. Ezra, this is important, I stressed. Also, you've taken some people into custody? Wolves that just came here, why? If you mean those intruders, why shouldn't I? I balked. Because they're here for a better life, because... I don't know that, Kale replied, his voice hard. They could be spies. I'll need to verify their stories before they are accepted into the Obsidian Claw Pack. Those are the laws. But one of them is a maid. She's my friend, I said, feeling helpless. Surely she can't be a spy. How do you know this? How can you say with confidence that's what she is? How can you say with confidence that's what she isn't? Kyle stood, forcing me to step back. The blankets dropped off him, exposing his bare body, rippling with muscles. Loyalty is earned in blood, not words. He grabbed the clothes and started putting it on. I watched on the sidelines, silently fuming. It was the same thing Victor from the Luminal Order had said to me before he forced me into this mission, and I wondered where Kale had learned that phrase before. Still, if we treat newcomers poorly, then we are no better than the Silver Eclipse Pack, who fell into ruin by turning away newcomers, or the Crimson Dust kin who ate itself alive due to all the infighting and inbreeding. Kale sighed like he was trying his very best to be patient with me. You've been gone a long time, Ezra. Things have changed. The people don't want newcomers. We're better off with our own. Trust me, and this Gideon character isn't what he appears to be. So Gideon was taken. I tried to keep my face impassive. What do you mean? Kyle regarded me. He was following you, which I had a feeling that you knew already, but what's worse is that he isn't a beta. He's an alpha, a powerful one, I think. An alpha? I spat out. You mean he was wearing scent blockers? From what I could see, yes, Kyle replied, his feline eyes narrowed into pinpricks. I don't trust a wolf that wears scent blockers. He's hiding something, I'm sure of it, but he will not be released until I know what it is, along with his kin. A chill cut through me. How many do you think there are? So far, 2, Kale said. Selene, your maid and someone they call Maeve. If there are more, they've hidden themselves well, but I'll find them. Damn it. We were screwed. If Kale found out they were from the Luminal Order, he'd freaking kill them. There was a reason Roran and the other packs kept themselves away from the Luminal Order. They feared their pack secrets would be taken and dissected by them, thus weakening our position among the clans. Kyle, I breathed, trying to figure out what to say next. Don't worry. Kale pinched my chin and kissed me. I won't hurt them. Much. Now come. We will see Roran, and then you need to see the doctor. I nodded, and he took my hand as he led us out of the house. Drake was waiting for us outside, along with a few other soldiers who saluted when they saw us. The snow had just begun to fall, soft and hesitant like the sky was testing its strength. I watched the muscles shift and ripple in Kale's firm back as he walked ahead of me, our hands firmly clasped. Each step left an imprint in the snow, but the flakes quickly began to erase them, as if the earth wanted no trace of our passage. Not for the first time, I wondered what this meant. If Roran was awake, what did it mean for him? For us? Could I still remain loyal to the pack? What about Gideon? I tilted my head back, staring into the sky where snowflakes danced down in a slow, erratic rhythm. My heart jumped and leaped in my chest as the world stretched around me. The trees seemed to grow taller, their skeletal branches reaching toward us with a cautious curiosity, as if they were alive and watching. The forest breathed in the hush of snowfall, every creak and rustle of its limbs carrying an ancient whisper. Seraph's face flashed before my eyes, startling me like a shadow leaping out of nowhere. I jolted to a halt. Kale paused ahead, his grip on my hand tightening. "Everything okay?" My eyes darted left and right, scanning the trees that now seemed closer, their trunks leaning in with silent intent. For a moment, I thought I saw yellow eyes blink in the shadows between the branches, gleaming like embers in the dark. "It's nothing," I said quickly, shaking my head. Let's go." Kyle hesitated, but gave a short nod, his hand warm and steady in mine as we continued forward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching and wasn't finished with me yet. As we stepped into the mausoleum, the air grew colder, wrapping around me like a grasping hand. The walls loomed, their stone faces scarred with cracks that seemed to scowl at our intrusion. Shadows clung to the carvings, slithering like restless spirits, while the dampness seeped through, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. It felt so different from the first time I came here. Everything seemed alive, and it frightened me. I clutched onto Kale's hand, but it seemed like he wasn't affected by it all. What was happening? I gulped when Seraph's statue came into view, his soapstone arms outstretched, his crown of flames burning brightly. But it was his eyes, so cold, carved from granite that almost seemed to move. My stomach roiled, and I forced myself to look away. But every time I did, Seraph's face materialized, cold and lifeless, sculpted in stone. His blank stare pinned me in place, and fear curled around me like smoke, thick and choking. Roran lay gasping beneath Seraph, the tentacles moved like worms, pumping and pumping into his body. Kyle stopped when we reached the center of the room. "Why did you stop?" My mouth slammed shut when I saw the Centurions standing there. But they had turned into stone. The older men had once worn their age in their receding hairlines and half-bald crowns, but now their gray hair was frozen mid-flow, carved in marble perfection. Their gray robes hung stiffly, as if caught in a wind that no longer blew. Runes etched into their skin shimmered faintly. Horror snatched the breath out of my lungs, and I took a step back. Their blank, lifeless eyes stared ahead, and for a moment, it felt as though they could still see me. "What the hell?" Kyle gasped. The Centurions, the Council, they were gone. And Roran. My eyes widened as I finally took him in. His half-shifted form was a nightmare-given flesh, his black fur devouring the light like a raven's shadow. The wings stretched behind him, vast and angelic in shape, but grotesquely out of place, their grandeur warped into something sinister. They twitched unnaturally, each feather gleaming like polished bone. His hind legs, bent and sinewy, looked like they could carry him upright, a mockery of human form. His chest bulged with unnatural muscle, and his elongated snout bristled with jagged teeth. He didn't look like a wolf. He looked like a twisted abomination of man and beast. Then his crimson eyes snapped open. I screamed. Kale caught my waist and dragged me out, and I kept screaming. I screamed and could not stop screaming. Drake and the other soldiers rushed toward us, but I couldn't stop. "Ezra! Ezra! By Seraph's burning light! Ezra!" Kale shook me, but the wails kept tearing from my throat. Seraph's face burned in my vision, flashing with rage, his body twisting grotesquely into a massive insect before it shattered through the mausoleum walls and took flight. That thing was not our god. If it wasn't Seraph, then what the hell was it? Kyle shook me so hard my teeth rattled, and then a blunt object crashed against my head. My vision whited out as I slumped against Kale. The world spun violently, my surroundings strobing with disjointed movements. I felt Kale clutch my face. "What the hell, Drake?" he snarled. "Altus, forgive me, but I've seen this kind of madness before. You must strike them to bring them back," Drake replied. "He's freaking bleeding," Kale hissed. "Ezra, are you all right? Ezra?" I slurred, trying to steady myself. "I'm fine. Sorry, he's right. I feel better now." Kyle helped me upright, his touch firm but careful. I reached for the back of my head, and my fingers came away wet with blood. It would heal soon enough. I took several deep breaths to calm down, and then I grabbed Kale's shirt, fisting it. "Did you see it? Roarin'?" "He was awake. Did you see it?" "What? What are you talking about? He's not awake." "He is. I saw him." "Ezra, everything was just the same as when we last saw it. With the exceptions of the Centurions, there's been no change," Kale said slowly. No, impossible." I stood up and ran back inside the mausoleum, my heart racing. The second I got inside, I saw that he was right. The Centurions were still standing there, and Roran was still in his wolf form slumped on the stage. Nothing had changed. Then, I stared at him disbelievingly. "Why did you stop?" "Because of this," Kale said, jerking his chin up to Seraph. His eyes, they ran rivers of blood. I was shaking by the time we made it back to the mansion. Kale was speaking in a low voice to Drake, instructing him not to let anyone go anywhere, but still, nothing was making any sense. Why was Seraph crying? Why did I see Roran awake, but he was still asleep? My skin was crawling, and I felt unhinged, flinching at every loud noise and movement. I sat on a chair near the window, wringing my hands, staring out into the abyss. Yellow eyes seemed to follow me. They danced in the shadows, and I felt as if I were going to be freaking sick. "Altus," Drake whispered urgently in Kale's ear. "There's a disturbance at the gate." "Okay, give me 1 second. I have to go." Kale knelt in front of me. "Try not to work yourself up." "No, please, Kyle." I gripped his shirt. "Don't leave me. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong." "I know." Kale cupped my face, stroking the apple of my cheek. "Just stay here. Don't go anywhere, please." "I'll be back soon, I promise." He kissed me, and I chased his mouth, desperate to hold him there. But he was already pulling back. Kyle signaled to the others, and everyone walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the shadows. My heart leaped into my throat when a low creaking noise came from the door, the sound like a whisper of something ancient stirring. Panic surged through me, and I ran, sprinting up the stairs and into my bedroom. I slammed the door shut, but the air seemed to press in tighter, shrinking until I could barely breathe. Then the hairs on the back of my neck bristled. I wasn't alone. Someone else was in the room. Swallowing hard, I turned around slowly, sweat beading on my brow. My stomach churned violently as my gaze landed on him. Roran stood cloaked in shadow, his massive form almost too large for the room, his black horns grazing the ceiling like spikes. The darkness wrapped around him like a living thing, but it couldn't hide the fiery red glow of his eyes. They burned, like embers in the abyss.